And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. Oh, what a fantastic crowd we have out there in the ideas room tonight already. Of course, tonight I am joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, it's eclipse time.
Yes, it is. But more importantly, it's Cinco de Mayo.
That's true too. Well, it's interesting. We get a lot of astrological inquiries. I'm very interested in astrology, but a lot of those astrologers always point to eclipses and all the revelations that surround them. And that might play into tonight's show because there's a lot of revelations in this episode that we have prepared for you tonight. It's a special one. This is X Series episode 149, and it is the UFO File President 2024 election and the things that it's going to reveal. We're going to put out some things on the record tonight that are going to spin really out into outer orbit. And we're going to do it all with you here tonight, going deep on RFK Jr.'s candidacy for the presidency, along with President Trump and his deep connection to the UFO file, along with the Kennedys' deep connection to the UFO file, and sitting in the middle of the whole situation, the national security state just blocking and creating their own narratives for 2024 to get we the people off their back. And the emergency powers can't be far behind. We're going to be taking your questions tonight in the second half of the program, so you can ask them anytime during the entire evening, and Miss Olivia will be putting those together. And I also want to remind you, if you're new here, especially, to sign up for our free newsletter. And that's something which, we send out about once a week. It lets you know what incredible shows that we have coming up for you, events, documentaries. And in this political season, you really want to make sure that you're in there, especially with all the intense, and I mean intense, censorship that we've been looking at in the past. I don't know. I guess since we started, really. Although it seems to have ramped up in particular. And for the political season, they just seem to be blowing Bobby Kennedy off of the airwaves, and a lot of suppression that we've been seeing on his videos, including our own. So, but we plan to have Bobby on the show to explain his vision. I have to say, I wanted to start off with Bobby Kennedy's presidency bid, because it's very important. He's moving so well, I think, in the right direction on so many issues. Recently, he went into the whole thing about the Zelensky money and the Ukraine situation and how it's getting into a very provocative pose. And with the supposed attempt by Ukraine, and I believe this, that they tried to launch a drone strike attack against Putin headquarters there in the Kremlin. Really terrible, just terrible ideas. What they need is a real peace process to end that situation. And apparently the only people who don't want peace over there are us. And so that's a problem. We're in the wrong in this Ukraine war situation, and we need to get in the right, and we have the skill and the resources to do it. And either Kennedy or Trump could get us out of that mess, which, has a real tendency and a real possibility, God forbid, of turning into a nuclear situation between the two biggest nuclear powers on the planet. We've seen this movie before 60 years ago, and it was President Kennedy and his logical, rational response and empathetic response to the whole situation that got us through. It was a very intelligent response. And we're going to go into that tonight, too, because it plays into exactly what we're up against with the deep state playing for all the marbles. The only other thing I want to mention is that, there's been a lot of strange activity this week in relation to balloons again. And, it's here we go again. And this time it was over Hawaii, and the national defense officials didn't bother with it. And they said, just don't worry about it. This is very unusual. This didn't used to happen. And so it's part of this parlay of the UFO threat shoot down thing. They're testing some mechanism in relation to this. We saw them roll out General Van Herk, the commander of NORAD and NORTHCOM, when we had the shoot down and all this nonsense, and we had ridiculous leaders like Trudeau coming out and saying, like, I gave the order to shoot down. And it's funny because if you go into the background on that, he didn't give any orders for anything. He's, the American authorities called up and said, we're going to shoot something down over Canada. Like, just stay out of the way. But then they never released any footage of that. So was that even real? Or is that just to test out, can we have this General Van Herk come out and assume authority in the event of a nuclear or a UFO shoot down emergency situation. And is that the only thing that'll save the 2024 election for the deep state, since their main guy, Biden, is just stumbling around and looking worse and worse in public appearances, and his numbers, even in Democrat polls, are down around 35%. And you can't win elections that way. So what are you going to do? Aha, emergency powers. And so this is the nature of the type of situation that we're up against. What I want to point out, and what we've really been hitting home with here on this show, is the presence of the UFO file right in the middle of all of this. And it can't be missed because it's a crucial aspect. And we've been laying it out. And as time has connected the dots of the things that we've put forward, not as a boast, but I want to point out that the type of research that we're doing connects these deeper factors using a combination of techniques. And some of those techniques, run deep into connecting the dots. Other of the techniques are almost mystical in a sense, but whatever they happen to be, we've been able to put forward these connections. And I want to put forward some for you tonight to really help us get a handle on what's going on out there in the world with this. I'm going to start with some of these rather odd headline pieces that I've been seeing. And then this is weird to me. Now, the big thing that was going on in the media, because even they know that this strike against Putin and the Kremlin was stupid, that they've been saying, oh, it's a false flag. Russia did it to themselves. And this is weird. They're using the language that they used to accuse people like Alex Jones of, paranoid, saying it was a false this and false that. Well, now they love this language and they like to use it themselves. And it's interesting when you think of that. I think about that arc of history, especially when I was on Alex's show last week. I thought to myself, isn't it fascinating if you think about, the years that someone like him has been on, many of the topics that he talked about, they now turn around and use against the general population. So the same things that the population learned in relation to the leadership are now turned against the people. But here we have it. False flag. Analysts say Russia likely staged Kremlin drone attack. It's blamed on Ukraine and the West. Here's why these people have no credibility on the intelligence side. And it's a real problem, in my opinion. The deal is that they came forward during the election and they trotted out 51 of what they said were their best intelligence people. And these people came out and said the Hunter Biden laptop is Russian disinformation. Well, no one believed that. But unfortunately, no one with a brain did. But they were able to get Biden past the election with that. Now, as it turned out, it wasn't Russian disinformation, as we know now, and that's confirmed even by jokers like the New York Times and Washington Post. So when we realized that all 51 of those people basically committed perjury or were just totally wrong, which I highly doubt. So what's the punishment for that? What's the accountability for that? Nothing. So when they get into a situation where they're like, aha, Russia did this to themselves, I don't believe it. I actually don't believe them because they're trying to get us into this war thing. And there's nothing more dangerous than a deep state whose support is dwindling in the public, trying to get us into a war footing, because they'll do anything to get us across the finish line. Speculation is mounting that Russia staged a drone attack on the Kremlin that it blamed on Ukraine Wednesday. Russia doesn't have the incentive to do that. They're trying to, control the situation. But part of the problem with the war in Ukraine is that behind a good deal of it is the fact that we said we'd never make Ukraine a member of NATO. And, they were making moves towards that. And that's where a lot of this war comes from, unfortunately. I'm not defending the Russian action, but I think that we need to get everybody out of this. And what you do, and this we've seen done by great presidents in the past, like, President Kennedy, is you put together a peace process and you bring the members to the table and you get your best guys in there and you put it together. Where is it? It doesn't exist in this administration. And we're finding out also that people in the administration, like Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, is one of the worst secretaries of state in history, is, he was doing all kinds of things in the background for the Biden campaign that were illegal before Biden even got in. So, we basically have people who have a lot of reason to keep Biden in power. The problem is they're dragging us all along into war with them. And so it's a very dangerous situation. One of the things I want to point out in relation to Bobby Kennedy's presidency is he is calling it out. And he's saying, look, this is wrong. And we're provoking Russia. We shouldn't have said we put Ukraine as part of NATO. And he's agreed with the, putting in humanitarian aid for Ukraine, but he doesn't want us in this situation. And he feels like it's dangerous. And he thought that the situation, if we could imagine somebody lobbing a drone at the Capitol, this is the same type of provocation. So he knows from his own experience and from his family's experience what a deep state false flag looks like. And so he's giving us that. He also went on the record with a number of very good positions this week. And the action against him is heating up as well. But here he is saying the World Economic Foundation and Bill Gates are using climate change to control the population. That's heavy duty because he's an environmental lawyer, remember. So this is a guy who cares deeply about the environment, but he knows we can be played with that subject. And so he's bringing it home and really giving us, some of those good points that we need, and Democrats too, to realize, aha, even though I believe in the environment, I'm not going to go for these people, sort of giving me this runaround and saying, oh, well, you have to pay tax credits and all this stuff for your carbon use. He realizes the centralization that's involved. But coming on the Democratic side, I think this is quite a political earthquake. In a sense, in a true sense, Bobby is to the political process in 2024 what Trump was to the political process in 2016. It's an upset. And it's got a populist side to it, and it's crucial in a sense. I think that Kennedy is proving more and more as he's on the trail that as he's sharpening his positions, that he is proving to be a really good choice going forward. And I still see a lot of flack around Kennedy. And, this is one that came up before, and it was Fauci Rip's very disturbed RFK Jr.'s attacks on his career. It's a shame because he's a Kennedy. There's our friend, the most corrupt government official to come down the pike in a long, long time. And, the media picked up on this with the whole Disturbed thing. And they're always like, oh, that crazy crackpot, that fringe vaccine anti-vaxxer, But I thought it was interesting because someone, when they were talking to Fauci, they asked, well, didn't you have this meeting in the White House with RFK Jr. and Trump and everything? And his responses were interesting. He says, well, I did not speak with RFK Jr. at the Trump White House. We invited him to NIH and he spoke to me. He spoke to Dr. Collins, the NIH director, and several of us, but he just gave a presentation that was full of inaccuracies and distortions. Yeah, like your entire run. RFK Jr. blamed Dr. Fauci for catastrophic mismanagement of the COVID-19 pandemic in a statement on Yahoo, and for adopting a militarized response to a public health crisis in response to Fauci's comments. So, we can really see that RFK Jr. is on the beam with this, and he is lined up against the right people. I've found, there's been some comments that people have sent me who said things like, well, why hasn't he spoken out on 9/11 or something? It's interesting with the independent media. We got to be careful because we know a number of things and we've studied a number of things, but it's not like any person who's running for president can pick up every issue and be perfect on every issue that we want across the board. It's an impossible standard. And, Trump would flunk the same standard. It doesn't work that way. But what you want to do is get enough of a person who understands enough of the important issues that are facing us that can get us moving in a totally different direction. This is crucial, and the timing in relation to this is crucial. I have not seen anyone approaching this level since Trump's original candidacy. And then if you go back before that, you have to go back to something, I don't know, Ross Perot, maybe.
Good point.
And it's interesting, too, because Perot was an independent candidate. So he had the luxury of running as an independent. And he actually kind of blew it in a sense, because he got 20% as an independent, which means he could have won, because even the winning percentage was only 40. It was Clinton 40 and I think Bush 38. What happened there is interesting because he was leading, but they spooked him saying like, oh, we'll ruin your daughter's wedding or something like that. And it's very interesting because Perot becomes sort of a setup for Trump. He's like, the original kind of archetype. And if you go back further, you can find independent candidates who made that difference. The problem with the independent candidacy now, and why a lot of people are saying, why doesn't RFK just run as an independent? The infrastructure isn't there for independent candidates. So it's like with Trump in 2016, he had to take over the Republican Party and run it independently from there. And I think that RFK Jr. is in the same exact position doing this. So we have to kind of look at that realistically. Another couple of things that came out this week was the White House won't talk about the CIA director Burns meeting with Jeffrey Epstein. I mean, do we need any more confirmation of just how corrupt the Central Intelligence Agency is? Here it is. We have the director meeting with Epstein long after he'd been convicted of sex crimes. And why is he meeting him? We know about Epstein and his deep dealings there. And this program is going to go tonight into the UFO file. But I want to say this in relation to Epstein and the CIA, which is, that organization is more out of control and more bloated and causing more mayhem around the globe than it was in President Kennedy's time. So ultimately, something in government, through legally established methods needs to be done about this out of control agency. And those were the things that President Kennedy was trying to accomplish. Other presidents also sought to limit the ability of the Central Intelligence Agency. And over again, we ended up with them having more and more authority and outsmarting and outfoxing the officials because of the nature of that organization. So one of the things that Bobby Kennedy said he would do is he would split it up so it would become accountable. I liked the sound of that also. And given his family's long history with the Central Intelligence Agency of over 70 years, they know it better than anyone else of the level of corruption that's involved there, and the CIA being involved in the assassinations of President Kennedy and Senator Robert Kennedy. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is X Series 149. It's the UFO File president, and we're going to get to the UFO part, which is going to be really a lot of fun and great questions tonight. I have some real breakthroughs for you, and in a sense, this is going to be a historic show because we're going to bring forward some things that are going to require about 4 episodes of follow-up in relation to this. It's great to have so many of you here with us. And before we go any further, Miss Olivia, how's the temperature out there?
Great. Scruffy Scrubs says RFK Jr. knows the difference between the care of the environment versus the environmental agenda for government control. And Tyler Hoff says, has RFK Jr. discussed or have a position on chemtrails?
He talks a lot about the environment, so I'm sure he's aware of it. That's not one that jumps to mind. Again, it's going to be interesting to see how he fits these things in, because he's gone above board in pointing out the Central Intelligence corruption and the agency's corruption, the regulating agency's corruptions. So he's been an environmental lawyer standing on the side of small business and farmers and people like that. So the Kennedys have a reputation for this. He's going to know and have the ability, if he goes in there as president, to be able to monitor and put in the kind of safeguards against the agencies and the types of abuses of power that takes place, everything from the EPA to the Defense Department. So, he's in a unique position. I think as we see him out there, I feel more and more people are picking up on just how important his message is, especially in comparison with the corrupt regime, the Biden regime that we have stumbling about there in power now, but the dangerous, very cunning group that's operating behind Biden and that wants to lead us into multiple scenarios with America of, really, I mean, it's interesting because they know how to enhance different groups. So, I could point out the Defense Department and the bloated budgets that they have in all this defense spending around the Ukraine, and they're building up for it in the background. If you look, they're all, ratcheting up. There's some more that's going to take place somewhere, because in the background, we hear whispers of them getting prepared for something. The ultimate, in my opinion, is when they move into that emergency powers position, because we saw when they rolled out the COVID operation that there were a number of things that they went forward and stole the rights of citizens for. So they just literally blocked the Constitution, and everything from speech to rights of assembly and things like that were just taken for granted. They were just gotten rid of with a governor's pen, and the governor can't even make a law. Remember, they just sign laws that the legislatures pass. So we know that the nature of what they'll do with the emergency powers. So as they roll out of the COVID operation, they're rolling into this war scenario. Now let's see just how far, just what kind of a rabbit they'll pull out of their hats in relation to this. And we do hear, those echoes of the strange things that they have going on in the background for centralizing our currency, the CBDC, and these are all topics that we tackle on a rolling basis. There's good information coming out about this. The important thing is not, there tends to be this kind of panicked reaction, which is, overstimulus to it. I think that the way to get to the core of these issues is to see and review the history that we have that's still open and available to us, to see how we got into these situations, and to help identify the individuals who can help lead us out with their various expertise. And also the calling out of the leadership, I think, is a crucial aspect. And you see a lot of people doing it quite well. So we're going to keep putting the emphasis on the spotlight where it needs to go. For example, the UFO file. We're going to do that right now. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, the real question, Daniel Welsh says, will RFK Jr. reestablish the Constitution? This is what we're talking about.
There's no question. This is what it comes down to. And, we've been looking at suspension of the Constitution since the September 11th attacks, in fact. And as I like to point out in this program, every time every president signs the National Defense Authorization Act, they sign into law those September 11th emergencies, which should not be on the books. The first thing we can do to lead us back towards a constitutional republic is to suspend all of that, because that's how we got Homeland Security. By the way, Homeland Security, 250,000 employees. How do you like that for a bureaucracy? That's a lot of people. That's quite a mobilization of force. So, the TSA and everything that's associated, all that infrastructure came out of the September 11th attacks, which were never really well explained, let's face it, as we've covered on this program.
Okay, let me interrupt you right now to address this one question. So Gen X Nerd says, doesn't RFK Jr. have a connection to CIA? You can address this beautifully right now.
Well, I mean, he doesn't have a connection to CIA. There's one of his sons is married to a CIA, former CIA agent. But, you're going to find people who have worked for the Central Intelligence Agency. That's not the crime. It's the construct of the leadership in the CIA and the things that it's been tasked with, and the laws that it's run away with. I mean, President Kennedy said, I want to smash the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the wind. Well, that's what Bobby Kennedy quoted at his presidential speech. So, he is someone who's very aware of the abuses of power. He knows that we need a clandestine spy force, but it's just like Harry Truman, who set up the CIA. He said, mend it or end it, basically, after the Kennedy assassination. He said, I never intended for the Central Intelligence Agency to be what it is. It's supposed to be an information gathering arm for the presidential executive branch. It's not supposed to be doing, overthrowing countries or throwing drones into Ukraine and, or exploding pipelines and all this kind of stuff. That's not the job of the Central Intelligence Agency, but they've taken it upon themselves. And this is the real usurpation of our powers, if you think about it, because the whole thing about the CIA goes back to the National Security Act and then further to the CIA Act. Because, and remember, that took place in September of 1947. And it really, since then, we've been adrift with this because it's, Harry Truman called it an American Gestapo. And he's the one who created it. Well, he was forced to create it. But we get into this tonight. And I think once we get behind how it was developed and the reasons why, because we have to remember that it did come out of an actual military purpose. They had the OSS and they had these other things during World War II. But there was a need for a group that could go and assemble all of the things that were going on around the world and present them to the president. That's why it was created. What they did instead is at S&C, Alan Dulles got together with some other lawyers and drew up the charter of the CIA. And S&C, the Sullivan and Cromwell law firm in New York City, was connected directly there now to international finance. So they were the arms of international finance coming and squeezing America and these interests and business interests. So it's a different thing, the way that it was set up versus how it was presented. And that became more and more obvious to the point where by the time you have Kennedy in office, he's so aware of it that it's a war for 3 years of control between the executive branch and this other thing. Now, what's not often talked about, people will bring up various things about intelligence, crimes, coups, and things of this nature. And they'll bring up, the whole thing about the mafia and the intelligence working with organized crime, which is important. But what's missed very often is the aerospace aspect. And the aerospace aspect gets us directly into the UFO file. So we're going to dig into that tonight. And I guess that's really the best answer. Yeah.
Okay.
Excellent stuff. So let's dive in on that. Have you got another one?
Well, I just wanted to follow up on it.
Yeah.
In your interview with RFK Jr., didn't he basically admit that the CIA killed his father?
Oh, yeah. He's aware. He's aware that they were involved in both assassinations. And he was the first Kennedy to put it on the record that, went beyond the Warren Commission. Because even Ted Kennedy was like, well, the Warren Commission settled all that. What can I do? And that was the nature of the problem, I think, for the Kennedys. You can understand it, the situation that they were in a sense, as this American family and these things that had happened. And so much of the battle had taken place behind the scenes between the deep state and the Kennedys that it belonged in this other realm where the public wasn't very aware of it. And it could, it had the potential of being so explosive that I think a lot of them just backed off. And it was also, I'm sure, a very painful subject as well. But I will say this, that RFK Jr. is very aware of it. He was campaigning with his dad when his dad was assassinated in 1968. He was 14 years old. So he remembers it well, and he remembers the train ride back with people lining the train saying their last salute to Bobby, because not only did we have Camelot with Kennedy, and there's a kind of mythologizing involved, but in Kennedy's case, it's really true, because he wanted to set the world on an entirely different path towards freedom. And instead, the path that they were on was nuclear annihilation and conquest and flight madness, everything that the CIA was involved in. And we were just going over a cliff. So in a sense, Kennedy coming in here and correcting the ship was dramatic, and their response to it was to assassinate him. But Bobby's campaign is still, the 68 campaign of Robert Kennedy is still not understood for the importance that it had, and also for the incredible stakes that the deep state had in their own moves in taking him out, because they had to remove MLK and RFK within 2 months of each other, and also have LBJ resign. I mean, this is, the idea of a president not running for re-election, just imagine that nowadays. I mean, even Stepford Biden, 81, and like he can't even walk to the podium anymore. They're still trying to run him for president. Right? Well, we'll see if that changes. I hear some things in the background that may change, and someone else may be stepping in, a very well-known face from the Democratic Party. to face off against Bobby and this wave that's coming in through Bobby, which if it's catching fire already. So I think this could be huge. But what were the origins of this battle behind the scenes with the Kennedys, and why does the UFO file figure so prominently in the middle of it? Well, even when you get to the alleged assassin of President Kennedy, this is one of the things that Jim Garrison found. You're surrounded by strange aerospace connections, even when you get to Oswald. During Kennedy's presidency, there's a number of unusual aerospace moves. And then involved in the Robert Kennedy assassination is Thane Eugene Caesar, who was the actual assassin there instead of Sirhan. There's a lot of evidence for that, autopsy evidence, really hardcore evidence that the police ignored, with the coroner saying, oh no, the shot came directly from behind him and was touching his skin. Well, the only person who was there with the gun was Thane Eugene Caesar, who then fled to the Philippines. I put all this in a documentary, which is called X Protect the UFO File Assassins. There's a section in there that's particularly important, and it comes in tonight, which is Thane Eugene Caesar worked at Skunk Works. And Skunk Works is UFO redevelopment central. So this group, the X Protect group, operates inside the Central Intelligence Agency. And so when we say, well, they were assassinated by the Central Intelligence Agency, it's true. But it's the aerospace wing. And this is the conclusion of Jim Garrison. As a matter of fact, he writes off this letter in 1968 and sends it to Ramparts magazine. And he says, I need to talk to you immediately. And the editor is running around trying to escape talking to him, because every time he interacts with Garrison, he gets people following him and all these things happen. But Garrison catches up with them. And this guy in the 80s would write his autobiography. And he was the editor of Ramparts for many years, Warren Hinkle. And he would say, well, Garrison got on the phone and Garrison said, I want you to take down the name of these defense contractors. It turns out that every lead that we were following in other directions was incorrect. This is the correct direction. This is the final analysis, that this was an aerospace assassination, and it was the military industrial complex. It was the aerospace wing of them working with the intelligence corridor that made this happen. That was his conclusion. He's the only person who actually prosecuted anyone for the assassination of President Kennedy. So think about that, and let's keep that in mind as we go forward here, because the aerospace aspects are so in control of so many different aspects, and they've been working on that space infrastructure for 50 years now, since no one's gone to the moon. There's been a huge vacuum in our understanding about what's going on up there. And that infrastructure comes into heavy play tonight. And it comes in through also a couple of figures we see out there. Jeff Bezos, the former CEO of Amazon, now he's the chairman now or something. And he's the head of Blue Origin and his space program. And of course, Elon Musk, who is really all about SpaceX. And, this thing with Twitter is part of the game there, the X game that's going on in the background. But this becomes important because there's a lineage there where we can connect these things. And that's the crucial aspect about how the political process got subverted and what we can do to take that back. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series episode 149, going deep tonight on the UFO File President 2024 Revealed. We're going to be taking your questions in part 2 of tonight's program. And I want to stress that those of you who are new here especially, make sure you're signed up for our free newsletter. You go to darkjournalist.com, and that helps us keep in touch with all the incredible censorship that we're seeing. It's kind of a direct pipeline and the best way for us to stay in touch. Okay, before I go any further, Miss Olivia.
Nope, good place. Let's hit it.
What do you got there? Are they having fun?
Everybody's having fun.
Good. Okay, we like that. A couple of things before I leave the modern era and go and time travel into the past to get some of these answers. Remember this Avril Haines note: UFOs buzzing U.S. warships may be aliens. Now, there's a new meme that's been going around UFO circles that old CIA, they have not been trying to push aliens, or neither the media either. shucks, they're okay. What's wrong with them? They're not pushing aliens or a UFO threat. No, those people who say that in the UFO realm are either stupid or they're being paid to say it, because there's so much evidence to the contrary. I don't know why anyone would go on the record saying this. And we've seen some pretty big people doing it too. It's kind of embarrassing, but it shows you also the nature of what we're up against, because there's weird pressure going on to get the theme just right for the next level of this operation. UFOs buzzing U.S. warships may be aliens, top spy chief. That's April Haynes. She's the top cop for the intelligence community. She's the director of national intelligence. She's saying they could be aliens. The head of NORAD, when he was asked a flat out question during the press release in February during the balloon UFO shootdowns, and they said, do you think it's extraterrestrials? And he said, I'm not ruling anything out. He knows that headline is going to be picked up and run around. And he was the de facto president of the U.S. for that, little span of a couple of days where they were shooting stuff down in dangerous old Alaska. But we need to kind of keep our eye on the tone of these things as we go. But I just wanted to put it flat on the record that, yes, the intelligence community and the media collectively are promoting a threat of UFOs, and they're claiming alien origins for that threat. When they get spooked out, they'll go back to, kind of lighter answers about things like, well, we're looking at Russian and Chinese capability, but we don't know if they have that. But over and over again, they try to sneak back in with this one. And that's just a fact. And so when we have people who are established on the UFO side coming out and saying, well, they're not trying to do a threat. Who said that? They are. They are kind of nonstop, as a matter of fact. And one of the things that they were pushing after the big UFO hearings from last summer was, UFO threats increasing exponentially, says Congress. And they ran that through and they got the data back from that. So they've been doing a lot of data mining on people. And this is a crucial aspect for us to keep in mind. Now, this week, another mysterious balloon sighted, like I said, over Hawaii. Well, we just wouldn't allow that before. Whatever it was would have been blown up. We have a whole protocol because during World War II with the Japanese, they sent over poisonous bombs and balloons and they killed people. So we established protocols in relation to balloons. Now, one of the things I caught in what they were saying about this balloon is they said, using the new protocol that NORAD has adopted, we found this balloon. They've always had the protocol to spot everything. If you light a match in a parking garage underground, they can see it with a satellite. So I don't know who they think that they're talking down to with that, but, oh, hey, look, we've adjusted this thing and now we can see all these balloons, and hey, look, there's a UFO. So there's a level of stupidity involved with this. What we have is a lot of human intelligence around this. We have families who've had interactions with the UFO phenomena for generations. We've had, people go back to the Betty and Barney Hill case a long time. Look, Betty Hill, her family had UFO sightings in the 1930s. It is intergenerational, and these people do know about these things over time. So there's a factor involved here, and we need to get to the core of what the factor is. And the idea of, them laying out after blocking all access to this information through the media and, kind of putting it in a ghetto of entertainment, so we got a bunch of sci-fi movies dealing with it instead of really understanding what it was all about, goes back to this aerospace question and goes back to an advanced technology question. It's a crucial piece of what we're facing, ramping up to 2030 here. And the biggest explanation that this Republican Congress can ask the intelligence community and the military community is, what happened to the 50 years of space development between Nixon's last launch of a manned mission to the moon and this Artemis project, which is coming in now? Remember, they were supposed to launch it next year, but guess what? They're not going to be able to do that. Well, Biden said maybe 2026 or 2020, so whatever it is they're doing with that, they're not ready. But it doesn't make sense. You'd have been going up there all the time and, coming back and having all sorts of things about it, filming things there, so there's a big factor that took place during the development of our space program that's been left out of our historical chapter. That creates a schizophrenic situation on the ground. And this is why we get into so many weird places in relation to this. And it's also tricky that, no one trusts NASA, and there's a good reason for that. I don't trust NASA because, they've been taken over, they were co-opted very early on. But over and over again, they've proven themselves to be not reliable. One of the interesting things that came out during the early 2000s was there was a guy who just used to follow their broadcasts, and he would videotape them in that era. And he caught craft and us shooting at craft, so that they had to literally, figure out, how do we do this, use these space cameras so people can't see or record this stuff. But we've had that type of intelligence on the ground. We've had people, taking pictures of these things, and we've been living with this for a long time. So we can't be spun out into some sort of narrative about it that, oh, it's this UFO thing that the CIA is going to save you from. That's the most dangerous of all. And people in the community like Lou Elizondo and those types of people who came in through the New York Times, TTSA, CIA threat operation. That's dangerous. They've been there, and they've continually fought and sought a way to bring themselves into this situation where they are the authority. And you notice, even with a lot of the discussions that are had about the UFO thing, they're electing a kind of false intelligentsia around it. And, so you're supposed to, who's the guy who dresses like me?
Lex Friedman.
Lex Friedman. So he was talking about how he was going to have Eric Weinstein on his program. And Weinstein's into physics, and that's all hunky-dory. It's good for those people to talk about UFOs. However, there's been this move to create this kind of artificial thing that, like, Avi Loeb and Lex Friedman are going to get you the truth around the UFO subject. It doesn't work that way. It comes literally from us looking at the information and studying it. It has nothing to do with any government organization. Friedman's also the kind of guy who, like a lot of other people, they're like, oh, well, these intelligence people have all these credentials, so we'll have you talk to all these CIA people about the UFO file. Well, if you know anything about the subject, you know that the CIA lies about the UFO file. So that is exactly the wrong approach to take. They're literally, anyway, I swear, weather people would be better to talk to about the UFO file. So, that's the first kind of huge mistake that I see on what is the supposed independent side, and you see a lot of this, and I understand how it's developing, but it's a false intelligentsia because it's allowing this intelligence arm to come in with this narrative. So we need to take the whole discussion to a different place. We're going to do that tonight through some very unusual things that have went on in the background just previous to President Kennedy getting into office, and how that ricochets out into the 2024 election, I'm going to point out. But it involves a figure named Nathan Twining. And he was a general, and he's one of these, he was the head of the U.S. Air Force Material Command. He went on the record with something that came out later and said the phenomena reported, UFOs, is something real and not visionary or fictitious. He was somebody who knew early on that something extra is going on here. He had studied it. He'd been given access to it. Now, Twining and the Twining memo becomes part of the foundation for Blue Book and other things. And it's understood that it's his testimony which shows that those people in that period of time believed there was something else operating in our skies that was beyond the realm of our own technology, which is crucial when you think about it. I want to introduce a term here tonight, and the term is espionage. You with me on that one?
Did you really come up with that?
I did.
Okay.
But it's there's a factor here which no one ever talks about, which is we have all this espionage around nuclear secrets. We have all this espionage around security arrangements and all these different things in relation country to country. Even our allies spy on us, as we know. But what about spying in relation to the UFO file? How does it work? Well, there's a really interesting interplay that takes place in the 1950s with Twining, and it has to do with him going over to Russia in 1956 and talking with Nikita Khrushchev and his high command. No, Twining wasn't giving away any secrets, but he was engaging in a potential exchange with the Russians of UFO file information. And Twining also becomes a major player behind the scenes and driving the secrecy as well. Now, I'm going to put something on the record tonight, which I have not seen placed out there anywhere. And it had to do originally when I was looking into an official that Kennedy had corresponded with named Horner. By the way, that's the espionage for all of us. Keep that term in mind as we go. Richard Horner was the Assistant Secretary of Research and Development for the Air Force and the military in the late 50s. And a senator in 1958 wrote to him and said, "Why is the Air Force blocking access to the UFO file?" The senator was from Boston, wasn't president yet. And he nets a response from Horner, who has a very interesting trajectory in setting up NASA shortly after. And he writes, "Senator Kennedy, this is in reply to your recent inquiry concerning the Air Force's position with regard to unidentified flying objects. The Air Force has not withheld information on unidentified flying objects reports. We're interested in the truth concerning reported sightings and are fully aware of our obligation to keep the public informed on such matters." Now, Kennedy had pressed them and said, you can't hide this stuff. This is 1958. A lot of people out there, when the Kennedy UFO part is brought up, you'll see in the media like, oh, maybe Kennedy was assassinated over aliens. Oh, ha, 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 and this is an interesting thing because there's so much information, and we put a lot of it on the record, about Kennedy's evincing an interest in the UFO file, number one, and two, the exchange of him and officials in the Air Force, in the CIA, and in the military over the issue. That there's an incredible track record for it. You don't need to guess whether this took place or not. Here's a letter in response to Kennedy pressing this guy about it, and it goes on further. He says, "Many persons," this is Richard Horner again responding to Kennedy, "many persons who report sightings to the Air Force do so in confidence and do not want their names, the names of associated people, or some of the circumstantial details made public. Since this information is not connected, is not considered critical or necessary for proper evaluation, their wishes in this regard are respected. As a matter of information, I'm enclosing the Air Force fact sheet dated November 5th, 1957 on this subject. Paragraph 18 of the report is to be modified to include the Air Force participation in the Armstrong Circle Theater television presentation, January 22nd, 1958 on UFOs." Now, basically, he's blowing Kennedy off. He's saying, no, we don't block information about this. And two, if it seems like we're cagey, it's just because we protect names for people. And three, here's a pamphlet of our official position. But that's a letter, and there's no question about the provenance of the letter. You can find it in Horner's archives for Richard Horner, and there's a copy of it, believe it or not, at the JFK Library, if you look hard enough. That's the actual letter in response from Horner to JFK. Oh, I guess it's a little bright on the screen, but I can put this up on Twitter when we're done with the show. But phenomenal, though it may seem, the date on it, March 12th, 1958, Kennedy pressing the national security establishment over the UFO issue. Now, I've said this in relation to 2024. The candidate who gets the UFO issue on the table is gonna be the one with the advantage. And so you might have a number of different scenarios. But if RFK Jr., for example, can incorporate the UFO aspect into his transparency piece, they're already saying, I'm sure, that, enough things about him that this is just another thing. But on the Trump side, something very interesting happened, which is, he went on another one of these bro podcasts, as I like to call them. And so he's talking to these guys. And, I mentioned this, that from time to time, like on Tucker Carlson, before they took Tucker off unceremoniously right after he had Trump on, that he starts talking and musing about John Trump, his uncle, who was a professor at MIT and worked in some very deep black projects for the government, including the UFO file. Now, what's interesting, there's just a little audio clip that I grabbed of him just before we started. And I want everyone to listen because, again, he starts to muse in an unusual fashion. I didn't include the part about John Trump. This is interesting when he talks about aliens. Listen up. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. It's X Series 149. This is the UFO File President 2024 revealed. Here we go. President Trump, are you ready? Let's listen.
I'll tell you what, you have a lot of smart people that think that, there happens to be a certain site that's the #1 most visited site in the whole country. You know that, right? What's that? Do you know what I'm talking about? Where they think the aliens come down? I haven't been out. I'll tell you about it after the show. I thought it was a different site. One last question.
Unfortunately, the bros didn't follow up President Trump there, but he was suggesting that there's a site, which is the most visited site on the planet, where they think aliens are going to come down. Again, letting out unusual things, shall we say. Trump is forging a background there and giving these little hints about his uncle, one, about the incredible power associated with it, and then the alien part. Like when he was interviewed by his son and he said, there are a lot of things that happened at Roswell. Very, very interesting things indeed. So let's go into the Trump piece here, because it gets very interesting, the type of connections that he lays out in relation to this and the type of messaging that takes place in relationship. And for me, one of the weird things I found out about this is he started doing it during the campaign of 2016. So he was doing it before he became president. Here, for example, is an article from August 2015, the Boston Globe, where it says Donald Trump says his late uncle, an MIT professor, was proof of his family's smart genes. But again, why are you talking about your uncle so much? And this becomes a thread over and over again that we've seen with Trump. Now, when we think about John Trump, this is going to be important for us to get a handle on also, because the other side of the 2024 election, we kind of have these great riders coming in. One is from the West, one is from the East, and they're going to smash the Biden regime in the middle. So on the Trump side coming in, he also has the incredible connection to the UFO file issue through his uncle. Now, we've put a number of things about his uncle on the record in the Tesla Trump and the time capsule episode and in other places. But I'm just going to say in a capsule here for us to get a handle on it. Both of these people, RFK Jr. and Trump, are in a unique position to reveal the UFO file disclosure aspect, which is going to come up in 2024. There's no mistaking it. They've already laid the groundwork. The problem is the CIA has been out there laying about 80% of that groundwork. And they're the ones who want to come into their own with the false narrative about the threat and all this stuff that they're trying to pull. These guys are in a different position. They can move from the transparency angle and say it is an important subject, and it is something that we need answers on. It is something that's withheld from the president, especially Trump, having been in that position. But Bobby, with his great history of transparency and the fact that both his uncle and his dad interacted deeply on this secret level. It's going to be a crucial peace in relationship to this. John Trump, at the end of his life, went over his many accomplishments. One of the things he talked about was basically working with Van de Graaff. And Van de Graaff was this incredible inventor who basically developed our understanding of particle colliders, and that's how we got CERN. So they worked together for 3 decades. So the level of intel that John Trump is coming in with is remarkable. And by the time they get to CERN and the particle collider aspect, it's a major driver of scientific inquiry, and it's the major user of the internet when it first comes out. Now, there's a lot of unusual things about CERN, but just as an aside on this, let's consider that when we're looking at John Trump, the scientist who happens to be Trump's uncle, we're looking at someone who's connected not only to the UFO file, not only to CERN and Van de Graaff and his advanced work, but he's also connected through Tesla to this Tesla technology, the X technology that we've gone into. Now, the person who put him in that position is Vanever Bush. Vanever Bush comes up tonight in relation to the Twining story that we started off with. Vanever Bush being somebody who was the head of MIT. He was the head of the Rad Lab. He was the head of the Office of Scientific Research and Development for 5 presidents. This is someone who made an incredible mark on history, the length to which we will never know, but we can start to spot through the people that he worked his magic through. Vanever Bush, as we know, his protege was John Trump, and John Trump worked with Arthur Compton and Carl Compton at MIT, and both of them would take turns running the UFO file after Vanever Bush gives it up. So we have a lineage there on the record about Vanever Bush running the UFO file. We also know on the record that he was Trump's mentor. So these are things that if we put them together in the right order, we understand who was controlling things in the background and how this clash happened very early on. Now, one of the things that Trump did, which was very interesting, you'll notice in his own administration, was he appointed actual military people to almost every position, even as his chief aides. They would all be military this and military that. He was almost allergic to intelligence people. If you look at the Space Force, it was dominated by military personnel, and there was a kind of a thin sprinkling of intelligence people. So he at certain times would go directly out against the CIA and call them out for different things. The CIA, it was said that their least favorite presidents were JFK and Trump. We know in the case of JFK, they assassinated him. But in the case of Trump, they worked 24/7 to take him out of the position. And their point man was John Brennan, who was the CIA director for many years under Obama. But like Dulles, even when he left his position, he still maintained the control of the agency. That's something that you see happen from time to time. Brennan, John Brennan, among his many unusual, strange crimes over the years, in the middle of some of these things, during the whole pandemic thing, when people were told to, wait it out at home, he came out with these weird stories about his belief that there were, alien life that were controlling these craft. So he starts to become this UFO proponent, and this guy starts talking about the UFO file. It's very disturbing when the CIA starts doing that openly, especially given their penchant for secrecy. Now, following up with that, James Woolsey is the former CIA director under Clinton. He was like, oh, my friend's plane was stopped at 30,000 feet by a UFO, and he starts to go into this thing. So we have all these CIA directors. Well, then the next phase of this were CIA people coming out and saying, I'm a contactee. I got abducted by aliens. So it's weird. It's a weird wave if you really calculate it. And it's only taken place really over the past 5 years. But that wave is very important because it shows who they want to elect to be the communication of this false disclosure versus what people would discover about the subject. And, if you think about the era of, there was a certain point where you had like these TV movies about abductions. I mean, you just couldn't avoid the stuff at a certain point. Well, I think at a certain point, the groups behind this said to themselves, we can't have people actually interacting about this stuff. We'll get outside of it. What we'll do is we'll make the agents contactees, and then people can learn about contactee information through these agents who we can control. So there's a lot of this going around the topic. And in the middle of it, you have these very heavy political figures interacting and jousting. And one of those figures in the middle of all this is Trump. Yeah, what do you got?
No, I just love this comment. Red Boy Genius says, if I was an ET, I wouldn't contact someone working in the CIA.
I know. Well, there's a lot of weird operations that go on there, but just the fact that they're talking about it, and I can name 3, but there's actually 6 who have been public talking about this, but I can name 3 right off the bat who've been talking about it recently, who are all high-level people. And I've named them on this program before. John Ramirez is one of them. Jim Semivan is another one. And it's a weird trial balloon. Again, how far can the CIA go in taking this over publicly? Real good question. Okay. CERN, Van de Graaff, and Trump. Van de Graaff, again, remember, Vanever Bush puts John Trump together with Van de Graaff. Van de Graaff is making very, very unusual technology, which is all about particle colliders, and he's using things like Tesla coils, 1928. Trump is working with him in the 20s. So we have on the record these interactions that take place. Here's CERN. And here they are in 2016 said, did you guess it? This photo taken in 1968 shows a Van de Graaff generator with its casing removed. It was used as the injector for the CERN electron storage and accumulation ring, CERN's first storage ring. And they have like, hey, learn more. And it's just, it's part of the deal of doing business. The Van de Graaff technology and his expertise is what got CERN off the ground. That's important because he was working for 30 years arm in arm with John Trump. So John Trump is in the heart of the particle accelerator business. And that's how you get CERN. John Trump is learning on the other end of the spectrum with Vanever Bush all about the UFO file. And then Vanever Bush sends him in to get Tesla's papers. That is how we complete the thread on John Trump to understand him in a nutshell as an individual. That's the combination of factors that we need to understand. How does this impact the nature of the technology going forward? What were the things in the background that were being brought in? Why is Trump, why does he continually talk about his uncle in relation to this? Whenever you have technology that is this secret, you need to find out what are the protocols that they're using to protect the secrecy. And the person who knew the protocols was Vanever Bush. Interestingly enough, the UFO file secrecy came up during the Kennedy administration. And in the background, Arthur Sulzberger, who was the publisher of the New York Times, real bigwig in his era, he, before the Kennedy era, in the 40s, when the UFO waves hit and the Roswell incident hit and the Kenneth Arnold flying saucer wave hit, he went and had a series of letters back and forth with Vanever Bush. And those were all about how do we maintain the secrecy, but still basically look like we're a democracy? And it was a good question. And Vanever Bush gave him some very, very interesting answers. Bush being one of the most enigmatic and I would say kind of unknown characters. Yes, we know the name, but this is somebody who handled all these major presidents. He handled the Rad Lab during the development of the Manhattan Project. He handled the UFO file. And he also was the mentor for John Trump. the impact, this is somebody who also created the foundations for the internet. The impact of Bush and what he brought to the table and how it interacts with our understanding about the UFO file is crucial. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read from his letters to Arthur Sulzberger. And it's interesting because what will happen after they exchange these letters is in 1961, there's some kind of a crisis that's not mentioned about the UFO file and it getting out. And Sulzberger goes to Vannevar Bush and he says, do you mind if I share those letters about the UFO file with President Kennedy? This is the crucial aspect. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show, X Series 149. Here we are with the UFO file President 2024 revealed. We're going to be taking your questions in the second half of the program. So maybe in about say a half hour or so. So Olivia, how's the temperature out there?
Great questions.
Excellent. Okay. We're looking forward to it. While I have your attention, I'm going to launch into this. Before I launch into this, for those of you who are new, please go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our free newsletter. It's a free newsletter. It keeps us in touch through the censorship, and it's something that, where we need a real direct pipeline, just in case the social media dance doesn't go as well as we'd hoped. But it does let you know the exciting things that we have coming up for you, including some remarkable interviews that you don't want to miss. So stand up and be counted and make sure that you're on the newsletter list. Okay. Now, a couple of things here. Sulzberger and his letters to Vannevar Bush. This was the technology I was talking about from Van de Graaff, using these Tesla coils and basically experimenting with voltage, radioactivity, and particle acceleration. Van de Graaff is recognized as a genius now, but a lot of his work became black project work, much like T.T. Brown. When John Trump died, it was interesting because the White House gave him the National Science Medal, and it was President Trump who went and picked it up from President Reagan during the ceremony. Now, there's some interesting things in some of that bio and in the obituaries that you don't find in other places in relation to John Trump. One of them is that he went in 1944 and left MIT and went to work for the British Rad Lab. Now, this is interesting and gives him an extra dimension as well. The other thing that happens there is when he receives, these accolades, and he gets something like 80 different accolades from the U.S. government, he also will receive the highest possible science medals from the British government. So we have a real tie over there. And in the middle of his bio, over and over again, the Tesla thing comes up about how he was set up to talk to the FBI. The FBI put him in there to find Tesla's papers and read through them, looking for information dealing with an advanced weapon. So as that is the background, here is John Trump standing up, and on the lower platform there is Van de Graaff. And like I said, this is them at the end working of 3 decades on the particle accelerators and Van de Graaff, Tesla coils, etc. Well, it's interesting. Upon reflection, we can see why Vannevar Bush sent John Trump in, because to get Tesla's papers, because Van de Graaff is working with the same technology. A couple of things on Dr. Trump's background. Dr. Trump began studying the voltage insulation properties of high vacuum and compressed gases while a faculty member at MIT, working with Professor Van de Graaff. He designed one of the first million-volt X-ray generators. And what we end up doing with the X-ray technology is creating shortwave for measuring communications in space. So in fact, John Trump becomes a space scientist of sorts. In World War II, Dr. Trump was influential in the development of radar and shortwave radar equipment. He was appointed director of the British branch of the MIT radiation lab in 1944. After the war, he became associated with the Department of Radiology, and they were doing interesting things in relation to cancer treatment and things of this nature. He was the recipient of many awards, including His Majesty's Medal given by George VI in 1947. Pretty key year, if you think about it. He was presented with the President's Certificate of Merit by President Truman in 1948. John Trump was no slouch. There's a number of different things. One of the interesting things I found is that his daughter was listed as living in Los Alamos. And, that is the haven there for advanced technology and UFO redevelopment. I just thought that was amusing. When we think of John Trump, we're getting the essence of somebody who is at the very core of the advanced program around the exotic technology related to the UFO file. We can wrap our heads around that, then we can start to understand why it's being brought up over and over again by our friend President Trump. Okay, I promised you some letters between Sulzberger and Bush. Here they are talking about that secrecy and the UFO file and how to handle it. And Sulzberger says, this is in 1961, in response to these letters that Bush gets from Sulzberger. Because remember, they had the original exchange in 1947 about what do we do in relation to this UFO secrecy. Now, this is Bush writing to Sulzberger. Dear Mr. Sulzberger, it was very pleasant indeed to hear from you on June. I remember well our exchange of letters back in 1947 and 48. And the conferences we had at that time on what then now is a very tough problem with many aspects to it, UFO secrecy. Of course, I will be entirely happy for you to use any part of that correspondence in any way you think will be useful in the present circumstances. It would be a fine thing if a really workable code could be formulated which would meet both sides of this tough question, UFO secrecy. Now, the UFO secrecy part is the unstated part. But what he's saying is we need a code. So I've developed Steganography for all of this. And for this new problem that you have, you need a code like the one I developed. Cordially yours. That is Vanever Bush's letter there to Sulzberger. Now, this is the letter he's responding to. Dear Dr. Bush, back in 1947, we had some correspondence with respect to government secrecy, which might be of interest in the present time to some of President Kennedy's advisors, since these questions have again arisen. I'm enclosing a copy of our exchange, and in view of the fact of a portion of it marked personal and confidential, I would like your permission to send it to Pierre Salinger and the request that he direct it to the President confidentially. With all good wishes, I am yours. And he sends it to Vanever Bush, who's still at MIT. Bush is in a unique position here because he's helped FDR, Truman, and Eisenhower keep the UFO file secret. But Kennedy's in a weird ballgame because he's in the middle of a situation where he wants to share some aspect of it with the Russians. And they're trying to figure out a way, how can we talk about some of these things without it getting out and getting ahead of us? How can we still keep it, under presidential control? There's another aspect that's not stated here, which is during the Eisenhower administration, when he has a stroke, he loses control of a lot of things inside the government before he comes back. In that interim, President Nixon, who's the vice president, takes over for about 6 weeks. And in that period of time, there's a lot of redevelopment and grabbing of moving off of the UFO file into corporate hands. Now, what happens, and what's interesting about that is when Eisenhower says, watch out for the military-industrial complex and all that, it's kind of admitting that I can't get the UFO file back from them. And so they've put it out in a way that the people can't track it and the government can't track it because they've placed it somewhere. And the level of secrecy they've put on it won't allow the average person to get at it. Now, the place that they put it was in the heart of the defense contractor's aerospace wing. That's where they decided there could be no follow-up. And they felt, well, since the defense contractors have that obligation to the government, this will be the perfect way to avoid somebody getting information about it. Because there were tremendous leaks. One, and I'm going to discuss one of those leaks that really changed the entire situation. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show X Series 149. This is the UFO File President. Some background to give us some heads up on what the 2024 election is all about in relation to UFO disclosure and how that's going to play out here. We have some pretty major candidates coming to the fore, with President Trump coming back strong, and I would say looking good on the stump with his speeches, sticking to the facts and saying, I'm going to do town halls and all this kind of thing. But roaring out of the bullpen and onto the stage is RFK Jr., and his candidacy is going to light up a lot of people. Of course, I was there at Park Plaza when he announced, and you could feel that electricity, that something was happening. This is somebody cutting through in the Democrat Party. And let me tell you, the Democrat Party is in shambles and controlled and captured by interests, including the neocons. So the question becomes there, can Bobby get through all that and then to set the ship of the United States right? Well, we're going to see, and we're going to see how some of this played out through his family in earlier times. And then I'm going to reveal something tonight about the inside name for the secret space program and what they referred to it and how that's going to resonate all the way back from 1958 to us here in 2023. So some of that is going to, there's going to be some bombs dropped tonight. Okay, I mentioned Nathan Twining earlier, and I won't leave you hanging on Mr. Twining because there's a lot of interesting things to point out there. Again, he was the Air Force general who made this very important quote: the phenomena reported is something real, not visionary or fictitious. And what's interesting about him is there is the famous Twining memo discussing exactly, they're dealing with a UFO phenomena. They don't know how to deal with it. In the full transcript of the Twining memo, which comes from September 23rd, 1947. Remember, the CIA is only one day old. As requested, here is presented, this is his a quote from his memo. Just going to touch on a couple of key points to understand the whole espionage piece of this. Below the considered opinion of this command concerning the so-called flying discs, this opinion is based on interrogation report data. Now think about that. That's a little bothersome right away. They're interrogating somebody or something about it. And preliminary studies by personnel of T2 and aircraft laboratory engineering divisions. This opinion is arrived at in a conference, blah, blah. The phenomenon is something real and not visionary fictitious. There are objects probably approximating the shape of a disc or such appreciable size as to appear as large as a man-made aircraft. There's a possibility that some of the incidents may be caused by natural phenomena. The reported operating characteristics, such as extreme rates of climb, maneuverability, and motion, which must be considered evasive when sighted when contacted by friendly aircraft, lend belief to the possibility that some of the objects are controlled manually, automatically, or remotely. So this is somebody who already in 1947 understands there's something big going on there in relation to UFOs. Their appearance, metallic or light reflecting surfaces, circular or elliptical in shape, well-kept formation lights varying from 3 to 9 objects. Normally no associated sound. Well, that's weird because everything that we had made lots of sound. So this is using a totally different technology to construct the piloted aircraft. And then he goes on and he says, let's develop a security classification and code name for a detailed study of this matter to include the preparation of a complete series and sets of the available and pertinent data. And then he talks about everyone he wants involved. But Rand is always right there in the heart of all of it as the kind of key defense contractor in the middle of it. Now, Twining will move through the UFO file corridors for years. And like I said, in 1956, he ends up going to Moscow and hanging out with Khrushchev. Now, there's two people I want us to become familiar with around this. One of them is named Baldwin, and the other one is the one that Kennedy writes the letter to and says, "What about the UFO file? Why are you lying?" So the person that Kennedy wrote to and was pressuring was Richard Horner. Well, Horner, as little as a year after the letter from Kennedy, becomes one of the most important people at NASA. But when Kennedy wins the election, he gets out. He's not going to deal with Kennedy as president calling the shots at NASA. So what does he do? He goes and he heads up Northrop Grumman. Now, I think it's particularly telling if you think about Kennedy and his knowledge of the deep state and the government and how it worked, that this is the guy who, after all, was just a head of R&D for the Air Force. This is the guy that he goes to and says, "What about the UFO file? And why is the Air Force covering this up?" So his history is interesting to follow. The second individual is named Baldwin. And Baldwin is a member of the Cosmos Club, but he goes all the way back in his journalistic activities as a very young man, World War I. And then he develops these incredible connections over the years so that royalty, generals, the presidents, everyone invites this guy everywhere. Hanson Baldwin. Now, something odd happens in Hanson Baldwin's career. When Nathan Twining goes over to do this espionage to Russia and meets with Khrushchev and all the rest, he is basically representing some aspect of the UFO file to the Russians, but he takes Baldwin with him. Baldwin's just a journalist, but he has these incredible deep connections. Well, a weird thing happens with Baldwin that during Kennedy's presidency, very often in relation to his policies in Cuba, Baldwin seems to know before anybody else what Kennedy is going to do. And Kennedy wonders, what's going on here? So in the background, Robert Kennedy starts to get information on Baldwin. And a story came out that was about, the Kennedy brothers, how terrible they were. You know, they went after this journalist. I'll tell you something very interesting about all this. One of the categories that the FBI listed Baldwin under was espionage. Now, there's a few different positions in all this. There's some early attempt here on the part of the deep state to interact and maybe fake out the Russians to figure out how much they know about the UFO file. And so I think the idea is that Twining is going over to Russia and interacting with their top people, trying to see if he can get some of those answers. And they're sort of like, well, show us what you have, and maybe we'll share some of what we have. And so we start to see all these intense background CIA memos and FBI memos about Baldwin. One of them says, his travel plans. He's accompanying General Nathan Twining to visit the USSR on Soviet Aviation Day. And there's a series of reports about him. They're tracking him closely, in fact. But remember, the Kennedy administration, 5 or 6 years later, will also look deep into this guy because they're wondering what's going on with this. Here's an FBI report on Hanson Baldwin from 1956. An informant who's furnished reliable information in the past advised us that in June 1956, Hanson Baldwin, military expert of the New York Times, was granted a visa June 18th to visit the USSR. According to the informant, Hanson Baldwin intends to visit the USSR in connection with the visit of a high United States Air Force officer at the Moscow Air Show. So there's something interesting about this. It's 3 years before Oswald goes over there. That's also an interesting track if we want to think about it. But why did Kennedy tap him through his brother? What was going on there? What was the FBI telling him? Well, it turns out that Baldwin shows up in some very unusual circles. And he also goes through a series of name changes and things, but he is embedded in World War II and becomes somebody's tool and somebody's pawn. But the fact that he is working closely with Nathan Twining, and Twining is working so close with him that he takes him over to the USSR, gives us this whole espionage piece about them trying to crack into the intelligence side about what the Russians have in the UFO file. This is the actual memorandum. This one's from 1962, and there's the Espionage X memo on our friend. So they're talking about him in these FBI memos, and they say, in connection with our current inquiries regarding Baldwin for his article in 1962, July 26th, he's been thoroughly reviewed concerning the subject. Who's Who in America for 62 to 63 shows Baldwin was born in Baltimore, graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy, was commissioned ensign, subsequently advanced the rank before resigning from the Navy. He worked for the Baltimore Sun. He was awarded the Pulitzer Prize, and so on. So it seems like neither the FBI nor the Kennedy administration can figure out what this guy's up to. But Kennedy gets very suspicious that, in a sense, he is sabotaging his Cuba policy, and he starts to ask for information. Who's running this guy, basically? I think what they do is run smack into a huge UFO file secrecy wall. But there's a whole aspect that's missing from general conversation about the UFO file, which is we have espionage, like I said, about atomic secrets. We have espionage on economic matters, overthrowing governments and everything else. Where's the espionage on the UFO file? No one seems to know who even is a spy in that regard. So the espionage piece on this becomes very important to determine the players around the UFO file. And Twining certainly facilitated one of them in this piece. Now, I don't think for a second, like I said, that Twining was doing anything, sort of disloyal to America. I think he sent there on a mission to get information about their UFO file. Now, someone else who had a good deal of information about the UFO file was James Forrestal. Forrestal, close with Kennedy, as we know, and we know also from the many accounts of him that he was an impeccable military officer, served in dramatic campaigns, and became the first defense secretary of the United States. Forrestal goes over to tour the ruins in preparation for this job of Berlin, post-war Berlin, and he is going around there, this international force, and he takes along with him a young journalist who just got out of military service, John F. Kennedy, who has no political anything yet. And Forrestal is showing him around the ruins. And in fact, Kennedy writes a whole thing, including the fact that he doesn't believe that Hitler died in the bunker, which is pretty racy stuff for the period. Forrestal is a fellow Catholic, close to the Kennedys, and particularly close to Jack Kennedy. Now, if we go into those backgrounds around the UFO file, we know that Forrestal controlled a good deal of information around the UFO file. There's a certain point when Vanever Bush says he's directing me in regard to secrecy matters. So Forrestal has it all. And the problem is, apparently, from as much as we can derive, that there's a transparency aspect involved with Forrestal around the UFO aspect, and that he thinks we need to bring this out and bring it forward. And suddenly there are reports of him acting erratic and all the rest of it. And then finally, oh, you need to go relax at Bethesda, you're burnt out, and we all know how that ends. So he gets bumped off, and one of the things that people don't realize is that Ernest Hemingway actually met Forrestal. And there's a story that I ran across. And that's something that's not even on the history books, but it's an unusual story that's not in relation to Forrestal at all. It's basically a travelogue of somebody going to Cuba and talking to different people. And oddly enough, what he says is, one of the weird things about Forrestal dying is it wasn't with how they presented it, because there was broken glass in his bed that they found. So Hemingway out there in Cuba, hearing about this, he already knows that there's something unusual in the death of Forrestal. But the death of Forrestal becomes a very interesting, tragic moment for the UFO file. Here's how Truman regards it. He says, quote, "He was a war casualty as if he died at the front," President declares. Well, that is the UFO file war, because this is just a guy who's gone into relaxation at Bethesda, supposedly. So what war is he talking about? Truman, you can see in relation to the UFO file and in relation to the CIA, he knows the deal even though he plays the game. And this is another one of those things. So he could have said, he gave of himself greatly. But he's saying he died on the front lines. So it's 1949. There's no war that's going on. So he didn't die on the front lines. So he's saying something else. So that's how we get to a knowledgeable Kennedy in relation to the UFO file, because we have the person who's in charge of Vanever Bush giving Kennedy back then information in relation to it, not because he's an official and he's cozying up to the Kennedys, but because they're friends. So that gives you a lot. And then, of course, the famous picture of the Memorial Day in 1963, when President Kennedy makes an unscheduled stop to visit Forrestal's grave. And there's that photo, the classic photo. Kennedy was aware of the good people deep inside the system versus the others. And his battle with the deep state and with those forces takes us directly into the UFO file. One of the things about Kennedy, when we get to him interacting with the top brass, is he realizes that some of the top brass is directly in line with the Central Intelligence Agency. One of those people was Curtis LeMay, and LeMay was playing a double track, trying to give him reports during the Cuban Missile Crisis, making it seem worse than it was, so he would order nuclear strikes and get us involved in a war with Cuba. So that interaction is very interesting, because Kennedy, on one hand, respects the military information, but he knows he's being played. And so over and over again, he comes up against this piece of like, I'm going to take their word for it, and then I'm going to double check it in the background. And in one of the cases, he sends a guy down to Florida to actually go to the aircraft and to see, are there bombs loaded on the aircraft? And then when he finds out, the guy comes back and says, yeah, there's bombs loaded on the aircraft. He goes, I want you to go back and put your hand on the bomb, and then come back and tell me and say, I've gone there, I've looked at it, there's bombs on board, and I've put my hands on the bomb. So he gets that level of detail before he goes back and pushes back against these guys. But, and the point there being that the planes that are in that airfield in Florida that he sends them to are not supposed to be armed. And he doesn't want the military to prepare to bomb Cuba before he, as president, has given the order. So there's a lot there, which brings us into Kennedy's assassination and the UFO file aspect. There's a lot of information also about those alliances in the background, like Johnson and LeMay, and Johnson coming again out of the aerospace wing of the political situation. That's crucial, because Johnson, they used to call him Senator NASA, and he's there promoting the budgets for the space aspect. And he's close with the intelligence agencies on one hand, and he's trying to cozy up to the brass on the other. So basically, he's positioning himself because he's saying, well, if they get tired of Kennedy, I'm the willing replacement there. But understanding the aerospace takeover aspect and how Johnson is crucial to it brings us into that 50s loop, because Johnson is crucial for the corridor of all that space funding. And as a matter of fact, the space center that eventually ends up being in Houston and NASA and all that was supposed to be right here in Cambridge. That's the way Kennedy had it set up. But because Johnson was from Texas, he set the whole thing up there. And this was part of the kind of changing of things, changing the nature of things and incorporating a different government, in fact. And this is the government that was overthrown in 1963. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show deep tonight, going into John Trump, going into John F. Kennedy, and the battles on this deep state side. We'll be taking your questions here shortly. I'm running into it now. Let's say I'll go about 10 more minutes and then we'll take questions.
Okay, sounds good.
What do you got?
Undestroyer. What do bankers have to do with the UFO file?
Well, if you have something like that, you're going to have a tremendous, and I mean tremendous, funding corridor. That gets us into a secret system of finance. And when you're looking at the type of positioning, everything that they do is an investment. You have to remember that in relation to the deep state.
They also like insider information
Yes.
for their investments, right?
No question about it. But the space economy and those aspects, they know that's where things are going because they realize, aha, I'll be able to control things from space on the ground. Well, that's the original Nazi dream. That's why he was on a crash course, Hitler, to get von Braun and his rocket team, Dornberger and everybody else, to make this happen so that they could get their own space stations going. And the idea was we can control things with satellites and pinpoint things on the ground from space, and that's total kind of totalitarian control. Well, they're so close to it right now that you see the people who call out that system being vilified, including RFK Jr. And you see the other people who are battling in their own way, like President Trump, when he was in office, he set up the Space Force. And the Space Force is just a transparent attempt to say all the UFO reports now have to go directly report to Space Force, and that goes back to the president. Well, President Kennedy tried something very similar when he created the National Security Action Memorandum 57. He said, actually, what the CIA is going to do is they're going to report to me, and they're going to report to the Joint Chiefs for paramilitary activities. It's totally different. And so the CIA became a covert government, and everyone in the government wanted to figure out, how can I maneuver this thing, control it, or get rid of it without being a victim of it? So this is, the nature of it. Now, the deep state goes beyond just the Central Intelligence Agency, but they're a very key player in relation to it. And I think that like they've gotten us into this situation in Ukraine, and like they helped develop so much of the COVID protocols and all the rest of it. As a matter of fact, the person I showed earlier, Avril Haines, although I called her out on the UFO threat file thing, Bobby Kennedy called her out for participating in Bill Gates' exercise about the pandemic just shortly before it happened. So they'd all be ready with what was going on. Well, you had Haines there working hand in glove with Gates, and she's really the representative, as it were, on the intelligence side for what they were doing with the COVID op. So these things are interchangeable, the way that they did things. If you thought that, them saying, well, you have to wear a mask or you can't go to the store and things like that, they can use things on the level of emergency. And so when you get into the UFO file, there's all sorts of mischief that you can make with it. And they've been controlling that technology at least for 8 decades. So that's a conservative estimate, but just think about the things and the breakthroughs that they've had. And part of the problem, part of the aspects that we get into when we're looking at this, is those people have to break back in now. The breakaways who've developed this technology on their own, what do you do with it ultimately? You're going to have to present it at some point. If you have age extension technology and you have people who can live to 150 years, well, people are going to wonder, hey, why isn't Kissinger dead yet? And so they'll catch on this way. So the only thing you could do is like, okay, well, I'll pretend to die at 100 and live another 50 years, but under a different identity or something. They don't want to do that. So there's a great program in these circles to figure out how they maintain the grasp of the superiority of the technology, and they don't share it with the general populace. The UFO file and the X technology is key, it's crucial, and it sits right in the middle of that. And when we come into a presidential season, you get a chance to really expose some of this because I can guarantee you on the other side, they have their plans ready. So the candidate that comes forward with UFO transparency is going to have a real advantage coming in. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is X Series 149. It is the UFO file president 2024. Disclosure, false disclosure, true disclosure. Well, the two very different things, as we've seen. And we've seen a lot of people pulled apart, even in a community like the UFO community. If you look at those various independent communities around things, the UFO one became the most fractured. And the way that they were able to do that was by starving it out originally, so that people who were quality people wouldn't get into the field in the first place. But then by the time they roll out their operation around this, and they being the X Protect group inside the intelligence corridors, they had a field that was just, ready. It had been so beaten down, basically. It was ready for an op. And so the CIA promised them, hey, come on board, and we'll get all this disclosure stuff happening. The CIA is the good guys. So you're still operating in that whirlwind. And the problem is that the media, there's not a good enough understanding of what corporate media is all about in relation to the CIA, that they're hand in glove. And so that the CIA controls the media. So anything that we get to around the UFO file in the media is largely CIA driven. So this becomes really a core problem for people who want to get the truth from a better angle. Okay. Blue, electric blue. What is it about blue anyway? Do you like the color blue?
It's your favorite color.
It is indeed. Well, it's interesting about blue because I can tell you that blue is the code name for the secret space program. That's something you heard here first. And I'm going to show you the aspects that are operational around this, because Steganography and this blue are clear aspects of how they operate with secret technology. The Steganography we put forward on the program in relation to weapons programs. I've shown over 200 examples during the course of the show of how that operates. Now, it's a much larger thing, but you can see where Vanever Bush is saying, well, let's discover a code that we can use for this ultra secrecy. And he's dealing with the publisher of the New York Times around that, trying to get it to the government. And then years later, they come back and say, I want to share all that with the Kennedy administration. There's a program inside the Kennedy administration called Blue Gemini, which becomes the flashpoint for the secret space program versus traditional NASA. And what happens is Kennedy says it's a duplication. I don't understand why there's a second space program. That's the first admission. There's an admission that came out with him sending McNamara over to NASA to get answers about this from the paperclip scientists that were working with NASA about why they were setting up this other thing. Well, you've got a number of examples of blue around the UFO file, but Blue Book is your pure hardcore. There's no good reason for Blue Book as a name, the code name, but that's the one that Twining wanted. And this is what they eventually settled on. Blue Beam becomes later some expose that was a rumor whirling around that a UN employee got, and then it filtered down to kind of a street legend. But somebody spilled something about blue beam and what it was. Von Braun's warnings to Carol Rosin about the alien threat and how it wouldn't be real, but they would use it because they would need to keep developing these threats. And so many of his predictions came true on that. But then if you go in and you look at blue beam, a lot of people would say, well, that's a street legend. You know, it's one of those things. It's a literary device and all the rest of it. But in fact, it has this on its side, however you want to take it. It certainly sums up a particular position about a UFO threat being used to unite the planet into a global government against this threat and to wipe out through emergency powers any notion of constitutions and all the rest of it. So fundamentally, whoever leaked it knew a great deal. And, you know, and the idea they're like, oh, it goes back to this guy who was unstable or whatever, you know, none of that matters. The point is, where's the idea? What is the nature of the idea? And does it have any teeth? That becomes very crucial. Now, Bezos, in this battle with our friend Musk, he has blue origins. He's got his version of the secret space program, and our friend Elon Musk has X. Musk has X, and they've been rolling out the X technology now for a while. He is the point man on that. They want, basically, they've been favoring of late our friend Musk. But Bezos is right there on his heels in relation to this. And we know, of course, that Musk is trying to roll out the Everything app that'll basically do everything for you, including your laundry. But it's, you know, submit to the X technology and you'll be fine. World government kind of thing with Elon as the space president. You know, he was the nice guy who got free speech back. Well, look, I think what they've done installing some semblance of free speech on Twitter is kind of remarkable when you look at some of the other platforms. But Elon and his connections go a lot deeper. And, you know, DARPA is right in intermingling there in the middle of SpaceX. So you can't deny that for a second if you want to have any kind of realistic sense about this. Oh, there's a lot of, you know, there's a lot of almost like sports mentality of this is our guy. And I can appreciate it under the circumstances because there's been so much woke nonsense. So, but we have to remember the narratives and how the narratives are manipulated, not to a point of being paranoid about things, but to a point of questioning things. And of course, when we get to the secret space program, they needed their own code. How did they present these things? Well, the only way they could get to it was to use the term blue. And I looked for a number of years, studying the secret space program for a long time, but it was blue over and over again that came up rather suspiciously. And there, you know, there's 5 or 6 good examples I can roll out there tonight, but there's so much interesting history around this that basically, when we get to the bottom of the espionage, which is the countries stealing from each other's UFO files, particularly Russia and the United States, when we get to the bottom of why there was no return trip to the moon for 50 years because they were developing blue, and when we get to the heart of the group that has a political hand in silencing people who are bringing this out or moving the culture forward. So that's the X protect, X share aspect. X protect being we'll use any means to protect the UFO file. We'll destroy reputations. We'll change the past. We'll do whatever we need to do. You know, when this first came up in the 50s, they killed a lot of researchers. You know, Morris Jessup was bumped off, and you know, T.T. Brown avoided being bumped off by escaping to islands in the Bahamas, you know, like Eleuthera. So, you know, there's a whole piece to this. T.T. Brown was part of the X-Share movement. President Kennedy, part of X-Share. Ernest Hemingway, part of X-Share. So when we're moving into the era that we're in, we're looking at these people coming out and, now they're saying, hey, we're going to have an international space station underwater in the Caribbean. How do you like that? It's going to be run by Cousteau's grandson. What was Cousteau looking for all those years? He was looking for Atlantis. Well, wasn't it interesting that Epstein and his gang got around the Cousteau thing and try to get Alexandra Cousteau and get kind of her in compromising situations so they could blackmail her to get this information? And they hung out with a lot of scientists down there in the Caribbean. So we start to understand the nature of the technology and what it is, plays a huge role in the period that we're in. But there's been a lot along the way of them getting rid of people who would build a different kind of a world. And in the assassinations of the Kennedys, President Kennedy and his brother Robert, we've got them operating out in the open, not in a way that they like to operate. So particularly in the case of Robert Kennedy, the way that the deep state has to reach in and take out MLK and RFK almost exposes them and almost sets up the whole country for revolution. In the Kennedy case, they had the media so in the tank, and they had people like Sulzberger. If you go into the history of the Central Intelligence Agency, they had them all sign waivers and things of secrecy that you can't reveal this and you can't reveal that. So they could use that and say, well, this is an international incident about the Kennedy assassination, so you have to stick to the Oswald story. And so these people would say, well, I'm being a good American because, I have this pledge to the CIA. In the meantime, the CIA is participating in the assassination, and then, the government's covering it up and then using the media as the tool to do that. That was the situation we got into. The question is, what are we going into? And with that, Miss Olivia, I'm going to move to your questions, and I have more. I still have more on this, but we better go into questions.
Okay.
Starting now. You're up.
All right. So let's start with the blue stuff. Just a few things to throw out there.
Yeah.
Coldossi says, tell DJ that I think Blue Book may have been a reference to stuff being in the sky being blue and all. Food Provider says, Blue Light was the name of a 1960s TV drama starring Robert Goulet, who was an OSS agent sent to penetrate the V2 rocket factory in Peenemünde.
Interesting.
And the Buddhist of Boston Sports says, going blue in comedy, an X-rated coincidence.
That's really
clever.
Interesting.
A lot of people had insights in the chat about what blue was all about.
Well, it's interesting with blue. We're going to, in the ideas room, go through this experience together, because I've been looking at the blue part for about 3 years, and I've collected close to 100 references on the inside. The really big ones, Blue Book, Blue Origin, Blue Beam. There's a series of them. I even wrote some of them down for tonight. But what's going to happen is that's going to expand outward, and we're going to have a handle on what they're doing, because Blue Origin is a big piece of the secret space program. And what they're doing, in fact, is we can understand the secrecy in space this way. You take all these rules for continuity of government. You develop them. Continuity of government is a program that's on the record. Everyone knows what it is, but no one knows how it operates. This is the kind of genius of Professor Scott, that he kept calling this out. Like, what is this thing that they're using? One of the things that Professor Scott realized was there's a communications aspect involved with the continuity of government program. And that when he looked into it, he found out it was called the Doomsday Network. And the idea was, in the event of a nuclear annihilation, we have all these communications that will continue to work. We can continue as a government, which made sense during the Cold War. However, that program got abused. And then they just started to say, you know what? For any emergency, we'll need to do this. And so it gave them carte blanche to set up underground bases, to set up advanced technology, to set up an entire infrastructure underground that the above ground people wouldn't know anything about. So, because it's so secret, and after all, you're surviving an emergency, so we don't have to share that. There's no insight or oversight about it in relation to it. The spooky thing about it is I'd studied it for years because Professor Scott brought it up, and I'd been reading Scott since I was in college, basically, and I'd known about it for a long time, and I realized over and over again, oh, this is completely censored in the media. No one ever talks about it. As a matter of fact, it came up out of turn in a 1987 hearing in Washington about Iran-Contra, and Ollie North said, well, I was doing this for continuity of government, and everybody jumps on him and says, he can't talk anymore. We can't talk about that, and he's told to shut up. It's interesting because later, weird things started to happen where right around COVID, everybody, they had the NORAD Northcom general who would take over the United States, whose name was Terrence O'Shaughnessy at the time. And he was the NORAD commander at the time. He got removed and replaced by this guy, Van Herk. But it's interesting because suddenly he was, on the boat going to New York and being like, I'm helping the people of New York and all this stuff, and I'm the COG commander. They never had anything like that. So that was even spookier than them covering it up. Just like the UFO thing, when they talk about it and they're like, yeah, might be aliens. That's even creepier. So for me, we have to understand this. Fundamentally, on the UFO side, the UFO aspect exists. It's there. People have been abducted by beings inside UFOs. People have witnessed these amazing craft for decades. So it's already part of human experience. The government aspect, and whether they say they don't exist or if they say they do exist, they'll have weird answers for both that will serve them. If they don't exist, that means they keep all the information and you don't get to look at it. If they do exist, well, they're a threat to you, and that gives us emergency power. So everything goes like this. The culture doesn't move, and it's in a kind of arrested state. But basically, what I want to just stress on this is the apprehension of understanding around the UFO thing. I would say, it's a fact that there's something else operating there. You can attribute it to an off-world civilization, which seems likely. You can attribute it to an advanced culture here, an advanced technology here that survived from when we had high technology in the past in Atlantis. Or you can say, they developed the sex technology and it's a little bit ahead of what we have in the public, and that group is operating and doing all this stuff. One of the problems with just assuming it's another culture that's here is that when they get to doing these early, the UFO waves and things like that, it seems like we get excessive sightings at a certain point in 1947 that weren't there before. And a lot of people who are researchers attribute it to the atom bomb, but the atom bomb gets exploded 2 years earlier. So it doesn't explain the wave 2 years later. So there are things that aren't answered there in the traditional background. Of course, there are UFO crash retrieval stories that go back before 47. But I would say there's no skepticism about UFOs existing if you're sensible. We put forward too much information about it. There's something else operating. And so there's a fact, UFOs are a fact. Now, spinning that narrative and making it work for the people in government who want to centralize things, that's the problem. And so when we push back against these things, we're pushing back against that, not, people like John Mack or Stanton Friedman and the people who did the real work in laying out the research. Those people had it right, and they were laying out the mystery. These other people, Semivan, Elizondo, Knapp, Lazar, all that junk. This is all, intelligence bolstered stuff. And that's a whole different thing. That's a Corbell, that's all a circus. It has nothing to do with the UFO file. And so they need to be separated. It's UFO file research versus the, disclosure circus, which is run by the CIA. That's different. Now they have control over a lot of networks. They have control over a lot of media outlets. They have control over opinion in many ways. So it's hard to get the message out. I mean, we do it on this program, but we need to, I think when we look into these things, we need to understand there's two totally different tracks. And inside, you know, forget about the public. Inside, there's two tracks. There's one track that is pushing to get the real thing out. Yeah.
No matter what you talk about, I guarantee the comment section will all be about blue. That's just, people are going to run with it with their theories. It's great.
Excellent. Keep going.
Okay, I'm going to throw out a few more and then we're going to pivot. MG says, Blue Star was the nickname of Halcyon's medium who worked with Hilarion.
Oh, yeah,
and
yeah.
Chris says, MG, yes, Hopi Blue Star Kachina.
That's right.
Golden Girl says Blue Root Race Atlantis. Miracle Planet says Blue Rose, symbol of Anyi Yoga, Nicholas Roerich, the Chelas and disciples of the Great White Brotherhood.
Excellent
and Robin
point.
Taylor says, think deep blue, and then adds submersible supercavitation machine, and then think anti-gravity connection. So I'm telling you, all over the place.
Oh, that's great. You know, well, thinking of how they work, thinking of how they operate for things. And the codes that they need on the inside, they need to be simple but extremely effective, which is why Steganography has been, you know, so successful, because nobody ever really got it. And until we pushed it out there, it just seemed like one of those things that was there in life. That's how Steganography works. If you go back to Johannes Trithemius, and remember, Trithemius gives us all this information. And his history is very weird too, because he's an abbot at 21 years old in Germany. But he discovers all of these magical formulas and he wants to get it out, but he doesn't want to be prosecuted by the church. So he decides to use Greek steganography of a page within a page. Somewhere he's learned it. But he's employing these methods, and they've used those methods in the mystery schools. The thing is, the steganography aspect is something where it operates, you see it all the time. So it's not something like that is a code that you need to crack and all this kind of thing. It is something that people get informed about, and then the vast general populace will see this thing and won't know what it means. But those people who are initiated into what it is, you know, they've figured it out. That's a fantastic method that Vanever Bush came up with for hiding the UFO file during the early development stages and during the wartime period. But remember this, he was the Grand Master of the MIT Mason Lodge. He understood secrecy very well. There were people who wrote in the period about the Rad Lab in 1940 and 45, and they said that the secrecy was so tight inside the Rad Lab that it was different than, it was better than the command structures on the ground who were fighting Germany. So just imagine that, you know, whatever they were doing inside there. Well, Vanever Bush knew how to keep secrets, I guess, is the upshot of that. And the biggest secret he kept was the UFO file. Yes.
Okay, Simone Nyman. So how does the UFO file fit into the Great Reset?
Well, you know, just think you're controlling things from above on the ground, right? So you're basically becoming God, fundamentally. And so what they're doing with it is it's a command structure, but they understand that in the subconscious of humanity, that they have organic stories and spiritual understanding that connects them to higher realities and things. So they need to kind of replace it. And they have their own version. Some of them may even believe their own version about them being, you know, these star people, and that they should be in charge and that they should be kings over these slaves and all the rest of it. So they see themselves in this exalted, bizarre light. Now, one of the things that John Kerry let out at the Davos meeting when they all got together, and he was like, "We are the extraterrestrials, who are here trying to solve humanity's problems while they're giving us such a hard time." Calls himself and the people assembled there extraterrestrials. This is how they think of themselves. Now, back there in those stories, there are stories of visitors who cause problems. There's also stories of visitors who give culture and all the rest of it. So there's something operational back there as a mythology that is an echo of an actual history. For me, this goes back to the interaction in Atlantean times. That's where the information around the mystery schools becomes so valuable, because there's not much of a roadmap if we're just trying to understand the mythology. The mystery school keeping the information over years and then attempts at letting it out through public mystery schools. So we have all that theosophy, anthroposophy, and those things. They give us some idea that there are higher beings operating side by side with humanity. But what you get in the case of something like the Great Reset are these people attempting to masquerade as gods. And so they're thinking, in their weird exalted egos, they rule over humanity. And they also, inside of this, there's the whole kind of harmonic influence that Steiner talks about. They belong to something we can call the cult of Belial. They want to animate this interaction with this lower astral force, and there's like a weird merging of these people with that. And we know that they have a kind of a contempt for spiritual symbolism, in fact. And that's why you see all this weird kind of twisted backward thing. And the part of the problem when we get into trying to report on these things legitimately is there's so much of a knee-jerk reaction because we've had heavy duty Christian hellfire stuff for so many years saying, well, you're going to hell for this and that, and so that's a different kind of control game on that. But the thing is, there is a kind of spiritual devolution involved in the people that are involved in the Great Reset. And I'm sorry, but the problem with humanity is the people on the ground, I think, have a higher level of consciousness than the leadership. And that doesn't usually work that way. The leadership right now is one of the most regressive leaderships I think we've ever seen on the planet. And the Biden administration is kind of the part, to have this guy stumbling around, being controlled by remote control or whatever. Think of the power of the presidency and the contempt that the committee that's running Biden has for everyday Americans, people around the world. So we need the right leadership, but it's not coming from that tech sector. And the tech people, I think, are proving, like Zuckerberg and Bezos and all the rest of it, there's something that is not developed about them. Their empathy isn't developed. They're not particular, what they're good at business, and that's one kind of a skill, but they seem to have left every other human development ability in the trash somewhere along the line. So that's a big problem. We need the right leaders. And that's why I think the 2024 election is so very important. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is the UFO File President 2024. And we're taking your questions. Now we'll take some more.
Back to blue. Okay,
yes.
I'm going to end on the blue on this note. Tivil says the word blue comes from the Old French word bleu, which derives from the Frankish word blau, meaning shining or gleaming. And Gigi Young says, esoterically, the etheric body is blue, and beyond the blue is white light. White light, spiritual light, appears as blue to our eyes. So in a sense, blue is a blind or veil for higher spiritual light we cannot perceive.
Absolutely fascinating. Yeah, that's really interesting. I think, there's a whole thing there's a Casey thing on auras. What I love about the Casey stories dealing with auras is that, some people would say, well, this person has a very giving nature and I can see this, purple around them and this is how people would see auras. And he could see auras around people. And but what's weird is when they would talk, he would see their past lives in the aura. So it's kind of like theater for Casey when he's interacting and talking to people. But one of the things that he was talking about when he was seeing these individuals in his visions who were higher, that they were glowing, and the clothing that they were wearing was blue. So it was kind of like a glowing blue. So I find that interesting. And whenever we get around spiritual topics, it seems blue comes up over and over again. Just like them to use that. Yes, what do you got?
The Buddhist of Boston Sports. How many reptilians or extraterrestrials will be at the coronation this weekend?
Well, there's that whole thing. We avoided even talking about that, but it's one of those horrible things that's going on. And I wish the people in the UK the very best, because that sounds like quite a pomp and circumstance event. It's interesting. The other thing in relation to blue, I want to mention this about Blue Gemini, which is that program, which is a weird thing hanging out back there about Kennedy and the space program. And what happened was it got zapped because Kennedy found out, oh, it's part of this blue secret space program. And so the program that he was trying to work to replace it with is called Dinosaur, Dynasoar. And Dinosaur is interesting because that was a mysterious one that looked like it was more for observation. Then it became rumored back there that it was for observing UFOs. In fact, and Philip Corso puts on the record that the X-15 was developed and the speeds developed, and that they had tested a manned space mission. The reason that it still held the record for so many years was because you weren't supposed to fly people that fast. But that inside the military, they wanted to chase UFOs, but they wanted to chase them not with unmanned craft. They wanted to have someone in there. And so they had somebody, risking their lives, basically operating the X-15. And it was developed specifically by Walter Dornberger, master Nazi paperclip rocket maker scientist, to chase UFOs for the US government because they wanted to see them. And they didn't want them, when they sped away, they didn't want to lose them. They wanted to keep up with them. So let's think about it that way. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. I want to say to anyone who's new, especially, but make sure you're on the newsletter list by visiting darkjournalist.com. And that's a free newsletter, but it keeps everyone in touch here. And if you're in the ideas room, you got to be on that newsletter list. Let's take some more questions. Miss Olivia.
Timothy Guessing, Forrestal was involved in Operation High Jump. It's on film. Frightening Me says Forrestal and Frank Olson both killed the same way. Rehoboth Farm, Forrestal was John Connolly's commanding officer during the war. Are there any other connections between Connolly and the UFO file?
Yeah, well, one of the weird things in history is that in 1949, the last visitor to Forrestal laying in his hospital bed was our good friend LBJ, who had just won a Senate seat because, wow, they found this box 13 full of all these votes. And he got to win by like 58 votes. That's a weird last visitor, I think, to have in any case. Connolly's story and his connection with the story around General Dynamics, I think is very interesting, but he's close in with the aerospace aspect. And what's interesting is, Connolly shows up as somebody who's supposed to become President X in 1980, and all the money and everything is on Connolly taking over and becoming the president. Somehow Reagan emerges as the candidate, and Connolly goes down really fast. But Connolly had built himself up from that history, really remarkable. But yes.
I'm sorry, David Wilcock. Or someone purporting to be David Wilcock just entered the chat. It says, "My heart is open for everybody, as you guys know."
Excellent.
Welcome.
Good old Wilcock.
Okay. So can we pivot to Trump and John Trump?
Yeah, look at that synchronicity
Oh,
thing.
great. You're psychic.
Oh, wait, I forgot to finish about
mhm.
Dinosaur. I'm
Okay.
sorry. Last quick thing about Dinosaur. That program gets lost in the background of history. One of the weird things that happens is Guy Bannister, who took over, who created the UFO file for the FBI in the 1947 after Roswell, and who handled that. Now he's doing the whole UFO thing for 6 years. Then he shows up later as the person who's pimping out Oswald to do all these unusual things and pretend to be a communist and all the rest. So Oswald is working for the person who originated the UFO file. As soon as the Warren Commission shows up, they want to talk to him. He dies of a heart attack, supposedly, and all of his files disappear. But his wife kept the name system that he had for the files, and she will later sell it off to a library that buys it. JFK researcher got his hands on this thing and published it. In the middle of it, underneath the Kennedy assassination, it says Dinosaur, and then afterwards it says Space Warcraft. Now, there's nothing in any of those programs that was supposed to be about war, but this is one of the things that Guy Bannister, UFO man who is participating in the Kennedy assassination, one of the things he's researching is the Dinosaur program. That's still a mystery in history, and the Blue Gemini piece, we get something in that crisscross gives us the understanding of what the secret space program development by the Paperclip gang was versus what became the Apollo program. Yes.
Okay, you said the magic word paperclip.
Yeah.
Lynn McAllister says, did John Trump help relocate all the paperclip scientists? Let's start there.
No. It's interesting. I haven't found any dramatic crossovers with John Trump and the paperclip scientists, but I imagine many of them made their way into his projects. Anyone working, if they're recruiting people, Vannevar Bush, for example, would be in charge of selecting who they were going to use. So that's pretty crucial. So when you think about John Trump being his protege, that's kind of interesting, but I haven't found anything that suggests John Trump was working to select the paperclip scientists. Although once they recruited them, it's very likely that he ended up working with them. Also, his career is interesting if you think about it. The trajectory, the UFO file, Van de Graaff, and the development of CERN, and the Tesla aspect. It's a pretty... This is not a normal scientist by any stretch of the imagination. And he wasn't somebody who sported the millions of dollars. He wasn't any kind of billionaire like Trump was. He was a very simple guy. He actually lived in Watertown, which is maybe like 10 minutes from here.
Mm-hmm.
So really kind of an interesting mystery to history. The reason that I think we can piece together things from John Trump to this piece is because if you do the thread of Vannevar Bush, which we put on the record, remember that wasn't on the record. This is the weirdness about it, which is what was on the record was that, oh yeah, they sent in this Trump guy to check out the Tesla papers. One of the things we were able to connect up was Trump with the UFO file. Then a lot of things that happen with Donald Trump in the presidency start to make sense. When you combine Roy Cohn's influence on Trump and then his uncle's knowledge about the UFO file, then you understand why such a resistance inside of those political groups to Trump. After all, couldn't they figure out a way to, use him for this or for that? Instead, you mention Trump and then you have to peel everyone off the ceiling. Well, this is it. Trump is the one that they don't, they're doing the same thing with Bobby Kennedy now. Well, I hate to tell you, but it's probably for the same exact reason, because that knowledge level puts them on the same footing as this thing. And if people think about Kennedy's are all about freedom, leveling the playing field, humanity working together and things like this, that's anathema to those groups. As a matter of fact, they may see both Trump and the Kennedys as traitors to their class. So that could be a big piece of what we're looking at. Yes.
Okay, Dean Tant. Why did Trump let them take the White House? Why didn't he disclose the UFO files? Why did Trump support SpaceX, which puts all these satellites in space to monitor us?
Well, you know, the times take you to a place. So, you know, the release of the breakaway technologies is not something that any president can stop. What he can do is expose it. I think his efforts to get the Space Force was his effort to pull the power back. You know, remember that they both hold the secret. Okay, so let's go back before Trump to Jack Kennedy. President Kennedy held the UFO file secret. E. Howard Hunt, who was the top CIA super spy, confesses to his friend in private, the Watergate lawyer Caddy, that Kennedy was killed over the UFO file. Well, why would you kill Kennedy over the UFO file? Hunt says because he was about to share the UFO file with the Russians, and that's our most vital national security secret. Now, where have we heard that before? Well, Robert Sarbarker, the physicist who was right in the heart of the national security state, he went on the record and said that the UFO file is classified above the nuclear bomb in terms of secrecy. That's because there's something, this goes to the X research, there's something inside of this I call apotheum. And the apotheum aspect goes beyond, it goes to directly a distortion of physics, period. So it's a kind of distortion field, reality distortion field, in fact. That's why the big lesson is when you study the UFO cases, if you watch the descriptions of the things that they say, it's very interesting because you start to understand, oh, this is the thing that has really freaked them out, to put it above the nuclear aspect. Not that they're aliens, you know, but this effect. It could be that they are dealing with aliens, sure. It could be that this is leftover technology from a very advanced culture, but it's the effect. And the effect is it warps any kind of sense of reality. The problem is that testing, they haven't been able to master to a point where only they control it. That's a problem. And that's why they left it at this level, because it's not something that they can just aim and shoot, because it has all these field consequences. So the apotheum is the key to the secrecy level around the UFO file. So they've been developing that, and they've been working with it for 8 decades without any oversight from the government, even though we've been paying for it. So we pay for the space program too, by the way. So the real trick to all that is they've gotten to such a point with it that their contempt level for the public has grown, because they've moved into, you know, being, it's not a civilization, but they've moved into, you know, a separate knowledge base. And when you get down to that, you know, your reference points with the general populace on the ground and in relation to exotic technology are so different. You know, even when we're talking about the transhumanism wave and the AI part and how this is all warped and anti-human and all the rest, you know, that's the public part that we know about. So think of this other thing. You know, they're sort of thinking, oh, I'm an immortal cyborg now. You know, I mean, it's gotten pretty crazy out there. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. X-149. This is the UFO file, the UFO file president 2024 revealed. And we've talked a lot about, we opened up with the Kennedys, but I want to say this about RFK Jr., which is, it is RFK Jr.'s candidacy that they fear the most in relation to that election, because if it gains fire, if it picks up steam as it seems to be doing, if it sets fires in the heart of humanity, then they've got a real problem, because not only is he someone who's an expert on the deep state and all the rest, but he knows where the bodies are buried in relation to the COVID operation. And this is somebody who can really spin that entire situation and all its billions of dollars and all the power and all the trillions and all the rest of it on its head. So this is someone who I think the deep state is fearing dramatically. I've been trying to figure out who's a bigger public number one enemy for the deep state. Is it Trump or is it RFK Jr.? And this week, it's RFK Jr. Yes.
Ray Story, any news about the Nixon files that were supposed to be released 50 years after his death?
I think that's the LBJ one that you're talking about. And it is the date that this was supposed to come out was in June. And it is the X letter, which is 75 pages, that LBJ said this is to be let out 50 years after my death. And he died in January of 73. I don't know why they chose the June date for it. But in 1994, I think after Nixon's death, they decided, hey, we're going to open this up to see what he said about Nixon. There was something weird about the way that this was done. And they read a few pages of it, and then they were like, oh, this has to be classified. So now they're stuck in a situation where someone opened it, read some of it, closed it back up, and it's supposed to come out again. But what was opened up was classified immediately. So if you follow this, there's a series of stealth archives that are out there. The JFK Assassination Files are part of them. Some of the UFO files. They're things that the public understands, knows about, but can't touch. So they can't put their hands on it. And they've been doing this with the stealth archives for a while. One of the things that the presidents wanted to do over time was say, you know, they're not going to let this information out about the UFO file in my lifetime. However, I've been working for 10, 20, 30 years on this UFO file thing. I'm going to make sure my place in history is secure. So here's my thing. Open this time capsule in 50 years. The Nixon time capsule is very similar. So there's a lot of them. There's an Eisenhower one that's supposed to be opened in 2040. So, but that letter, you're right. It's supposed to be opened, and that's supposed to be coming up in a month. Are they going to open it? Well, very politely, I would say I've made inquiries to the LBJ library. Nothing yet on it. And if we do make inquiries to them, I suggest it's a nice, polite inquiry, because they can instantly say, oh, you know, we got all this harassment online, so we decided never to release the letter. But those pages, I think, are important. Why did he leave the X letter? I mean, there's the X steganography sitting right in the middle of everything. And again, it's a stealth archive, because we know it's there, like the JFK files, if we could just get our hands on it. Hey, by the way, some enterprising person sent me this. That is the actual Washington Post cover for the following day after President Kennedy was assassinated. And
it's in beautiful condition.
Unbelievable. But you know, what's interesting is, really, if you think about it, have we ever actually recovered fully as a nation from the media covering up the fact that the deep state forces were involved in assassinating President Kennedy? I don't think so. I think it's, you know, we've gone along over this course of 60 years with it, but it has stayed out there as a looming shadow. And somehow when we got into the part about the UFO file, the JFK files, and the Trump presidency, there was a crisscross there that held a lot of this. And people still know, oh, we're still in this. That battle still continues. And now with the presidency coming up in 2024, the campaign for the presidency, and RFK Jr., you know, coming in to reclaim Camelot, all those things are on the table again. So I think we go round and round until we face up to this and move forward as a culture with a full history in a full accounting and with, casting the rats off the ship. That is good for America, good for the globe. And how else really do you move forward? How does a person in their own life with a secret like that hanging out in the background go forward? So the murder of President Kennedy, yes, it's a historical incident, and it happened 60 years ago, but they're still hiding it. So therefore, the relevance for it, the accounting for it, the blame aspect for it, the implications of what they did and why they did it, still are potent enough that if we found out, it changes the game for a lot of the elites that are in power right now. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist X series. Okay, UFO File President 2024 revealed. Miss Olivia, you're up.
Okay, so I have a bunch about RFK Jr.
Yeah.
Joshicus Doggy Woggy. Does DJ think RFK Jr. was prompted by someone to seek the presidency?
Well, it's interesting because there's there are certain shows where I've heard people say he was encouraged to do it. I think Dick Morris, the Republican strategist who briefly worked for Clinton, had said he was encouraged to do it. My own feeling is that it runs deep in him since his father's assassination on the campaign trail. And there is a kind of a discovery over time and then an awakening that takes place with an individual. And I think that he looked around and saw that things were in such a state that, he had to make a try at righting the ship. And he's got the history and the knowledge of the Kennedy family. And, the Camelot wave, what President Kennedy was able to do in coming in and changing the world as he did, that's available. It's an ideal making for a country, and that whole flame of the ideas of moving the world forward it still exists. It's fired up. Look, Kennedy is an excellent speaker. He, I agree. When I was talking to Alex Jones, he said, the deep state must be like fully knocked over because this guy looks exactly like his dad, and he's like maybe even smarter. He's incredibly smart, and he's onto them, dramatically. So I think they look to the right and they see Kennedy, and they must get a wave of terror, and they look to the left and they see Trump coming back, and there's another different kind of a wave of terror. So I see them trying to co-opt everyone's opinions, so Kennedy has to be some crazy fringe anti-vaxxer. That's their whole thing with him, right? What did Fauci say? Oh, he's disturbed. Well, that's good coming from a guy who killed how many people?
I know. He's the largest mass murderer in history.
The desk killer, as they call him. But when we think about it, that's what they have to do with Kennedy. They have to marginalize him. They've tried to keep him off. This was an interesting strategy, but so much of the alternative media, the independent media, had him on that it was like, oh, what can we do? But I would say that he's showing up as a very strong force coming in here. What they have to do with Trump is they have to say, oh, he's got these court cases. What a corrupt person, insurrectionist, all that nonsense. So, and what they have to do is they have to pretend that Biden is still functional. Now, in my opinion, there's I think Judge Napolitano's thing about them somehow putting Hillary into the vice presidency, assigning Kamala some federal judgeship or something, and then having Biden go down and Hillary take over and run the campaign in 2024. Something to that. There's something in the air about that. I can sense that Napolitano, when he put that out there, was hearing it from very clued in people. So you know, I see a lot of Michelle Obama out there. I see a lot of Hillary Clinton out there. That's weird for this political season. So I think that they're looking at the Bobby thing grow and they're saying, oh, let's get that contingency plan locked and loaded. I think what they try to do with DeSantis against Trump, they're starting to realize is not effective. And I think that they are coming to the conclusion that they can't prevent Trump from being the Republican nominee, but they can sure as heck keep him out of the presidency. That's what they're hoping. And, so we're coming into a major clash for the 2024 election. And I think the repercussions are dramatic. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Sammy, when does Daniel think they are going to do the next op? Election year?
Yeah, this year is kind of important in this sense, I would say, as the setup year. I remember reading the biography of Gorbachev and how he said that Reykjavik, where they didn't actually make any agreements, was the crucial turning point to how they got all the agreements about actually reducing nuclear weapons, which Gorbachev and Reagan did. And, even Reagan, who had a Cold War, evil empire thing about the Russians, he would never do what we're doing in Ukraine in a million years because he's very conscious of the use of nuclear weapons and the dangers of them being involved in a conflict like that. So this administration reaches a new low of corruption and stupidity. It's like, there's nothing that compares on the level that they're at. I can't think of a presidency that's this bad. Certainly not in my lifetime. So we're in, I guess W. Bush, the Iraq War was
right. And to a certain extent, everybody seemed to understand that he was a puppet and that Cheney was really in charge, but this is completely different.
No question. Yeah. And Biden didn't have, 9/11 as an excuse, a deep state excuse. So now Biden is being controlled by a neocon committee. And I think that his level of mental comprehension is nowhere near what you would need to run the presidency. So somebody's running him, and that's dangerous too, because they can use him for anything. And that's why we need to recapture the White House. I think there's a meme in alternative and independent circles that say, that presidency doesn't count, or, Trump's in the tank or Kennedy's in the tank, forget it. That's weird to me. That kind of cynicism is also very uninformed. The presidency is the most powerful position that exists in the free world. So, you need the correct person in the presidency in order to have things, go in an ideal fashion in a constitutional republic. So the idea that you would just give that up and say, well, I'm cynical and, I can't check every box when it comes to Kennedy because, he's a Democrat. It's ridiculous. This is an incredible opportunity. And we have two remarkable candidates, which if they both have, the Republican nomination and the Democrat nomination, it will smash the Biden regime underfoot and we can get on with a constitutional government. That's the reality that we should be looking for and looking forward to. I don't think, good examination of the candidates is necessary. And so I think that that's important. But I don't think a weird nitpicking thing of like, oh, this guy didn't talk about 9/11 or something. We have to get real. I mean, the independent aspect, that the level at which we can get information out to the broader public is increasing. But, the idea that a president can go up there and say 9/11 was an inside job or something, it's not going to happen. It may happen after the fact of getting into the presidency. But right now, they're using so many things, just common sense things about, hey, these medical devices, and the things that Kennedy's brought forward, they're already using that, So what I think we can do, though, the UFO file thing is a little bit different. I'll tell you why. Because the establishment is trying to use it for themselves right now. So really, in truth, the incredible roulette wheel of history is moving in our direction, in our favor here, because as they try to roll out a false version of UFO disclosure, the real thing can come out, which means the candidate, because it's going to be on the table in 2024, the candidate who brings forward the UFO file in relation to transparency and getting at the real thing is going to have a tremendous advantage going in, and the other side's going to use it anyway. So it's going to be a factor whether they, pull something with the whole UFO shoot down or these balloons or whatever. The UFO file is going to be on the table in 2024. The quicker campaign like Trump's campaign or RFK Jr.'s campaign picks up on that and uses it, the better. Yes.
Mr. Wolf, RFK Jr. might be the most important catalyst we've seen in a long time. He might just blow the house of cards down. Fingers crossed. And Najat Madri says 2024 is going to make 2020 look like Sesame Street.
Oh, that's pretty good. No, I agree. I think that all the everything's on the table for 2024. And I think that the deep state has gamed out a number of scenarios, including cyber attacks. I think they've looked at that. I think they've looked at, war with Russia, all these different things that can disrupt the normal flow of an election. The current administration will not survive a normal election under these conditions. They need to create some artificial emergency to seize emergency powers and either delay the election or derail it. Otherwise, they're not going to be in power come 2025. So they're looking at their options there. The only thing that I think that they can do is try to select a candidate and slip them in through this process. But they haven't done a thing like that. The only person I can compare Biden's setup with is Ford. And Ford wasn't even elected. He was selected to be VP after Spiro Agnew went to jail. And so when they got rid of Nixon, they were able to run an unelected president and vice president. That's a neat trick. So that's what they're looking at. I think right now there's a group in there that thinks, we can run, Stepford Biden and try to roll him across, alive into 2024. But I think smarter people on the Democratic side are already looking at how to do this switcheroo. Yes.
MK, where is the Project Bluebeam on this timeline? Alien Invasion 2024, same as elections?
It's a good question. I think trying to pinpoint the date of when they're going to use the UFO threat full is different than spotting the trends that are leading up to it. So we've seen the trends leading up to it. They did a dry run of UFO shoot down to start the year off. That was weird enough. But they may have exercises that involve UFOs. For example, the Russian media, when they were talking about Ukraine, they said, we had problems in our airspace with 2 UFOs. They said UFOs. So they're saying to the US government, we can start identifying what these things are. If you want to keep up with this advanced tech warfare piece, we can actually let out that UFOs are involved in this fighting. That was interesting, and it may be that you're going to see actual UFOs involved that nobody takes credit for. And they say, we think it's the Russian government, or the Russians are going to say, there's some UFO there. Is that the US government? And this is how it's going to get involved. Just like with the balloons, at first, they had Van Herk, who's the Roswell, the guy who was part of the 509th Roswell group, the 509th bomber group. He came out, not Stepford Biden, and he said, what did he say? He said, they laid this question right across home plate, and he swung at it. And the question was from Helene Cooper, who started the whole phony UFO thing in the New York Times with Elizondo and all that nonsense in 2017. And she said, do you think it was extraterrestrial? And he said, I'm not ruling anything out. It's ridiculous. Because, first of all, he's NORAD, the commander. He knows. Second of all, he knows that whatever he says will get picked up in all the headlines. So he wanted, and that group wanted, NORAD general says it could be ET. They wanted to see the feedback loop on that in the media and in the world. That's the data that they needed. So they're moving closer. What I want us to do in terms of the UFO threat piece and how they use it is to think of it like they do the doomsday clock. And every once in a while they say, the doomsday clock, these scientists have decided, just moved a little closer to midnight because so-and-so country picked up nuclear bombs. That's the way we need to look at the UFO thing. There was this hilarious thing. This UFO researcher was on, a well-known researcher I've talked about many times. And he's like, well, the UFO threat, the UFO invasion hasn't happened yet. So I guess it's not going to. That's about the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life. So, they set up the COVID op for how long? I mean, they set these things up and then utilize them when they're ready to use them. They'll use them on their timeline, not yours, because, you're in UFO media or whatever. So they're going to use it when they're going to use it, but they have it. And I think the danger is when you see them openly talking about it, and when you see them openly rolling out COG commanders to talk about ET threats, then you're getting close to midnight. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. Deep tonight on the UFO File President 2024 revealed RFK Jr., Trump. These are the forces that are coming in from each side, and in the middle, the Stepford Biden deep state corruption regime looking to spread the techno-fascist government in America and throughout the world. Who is going to come out of that? Well, the Ideas From is going to have a very, very interesting impression of that. And I'm going to get, I'm already getting very strong impressions from the shows that we're doing about it. Because remember, nobody's as smart as all of us, but also no one's as intuitive as all of us. Keep that in mind.
Speaking of intuitive, Gigi says they have to run a UFO op because they need to introduce tech and a new religion.
Wow. This is the great thing about Gigi, like laying it out exactly where it is. That is exactly the point, which is they need both. They need the narrative around the religion idea, and they also need to somehow, look, they've developed this stuff. How are they going to use it? They're going to have to reveal it at some point. They've been hiding it from the public, but we've been paying for their analysis. So it's funny, though. I'll tell you one thing that's interesting to me is when I go back and I read Vanever Bush talking with Sulzberger at the New York Times, they understand the people part. They're like, how would the public react to this? And they say, well, the government should do this. How does the government maintain secrecy but still be an open republic? I mean, it's interesting to me in those private letters, you see, even in that period, even if they thought of themselves as elitist, they still understood there was something to answer to and something to answer for. There's something about the advent of technology over the past, say, 25 years that has launched these people into a different, more psychotic mindset, including the fact that maybe some of the people who are coming in grew up with that psycho mindset. So they're not really considering their role in government. So even those elitists back there, I think, were far superior to the ones that we're getting now. And the difference in the quality of how they see it, I think, is interesting because the people who are operating in the leadership now, I can say almost without exception, are just kind of driving off a cliff. They're locked up in their own fantasy insanity, and they're being possessed in that sense. That's about the best way to
everybody's so funny tonight, but a little dirty.
Okay, what do you got?
Okay, let's head back. Let's go meta for a second. So Jeffrey Thomas wants to know, why do these people at the top have such an issue with global peace and prosperity for all? That's like an Olivia question.
Would you care to answer it?
Well, I mean, you can't help but think, I don't know, I come up against it all the time. It's like, are they human? You know, because they're not human the way I'm human. I can say that much. So then it begs the question, are they alien? Are they psychopathic? Are they occultists? Dark occultists?
I
Yeah, I'm not
remember
sure.
an interesting Rudolf Steiner. He had an interesting interaction. Steiner saw a lot of visions. But there was someone who was a religious person who was slowly becoming more and more of a zealot. And Steiner was very spiritual and, believed in religion, but he also knew that religious zealotry can be just as dangerous as anything else. And so as he was looking at this person transforming over time when he was interacting with them, by the time they had become a real fanatic, he saw a person behind them who looked like they were someone who had operated during the Spanish Inquisition, and that their kind of openness, the person's openness to this spiritual path had been corrupted by this other influence, this kind of discarnate thing that was working through them. And in that case, it was someone who, wanted to burn those who resisted their version of God at the stake. So Steiner's seeing that through that film. He sees this, this person. So when we think about that and we think about the influences that are around us, I think about the Ahrimanic piece that he's telling us about. When I see these people like Schwab and others, for example, who I think have given themselves over to an evil disposition, I think that they're being influenced in such a way that who they are is being replaced by this thing. And I think that the thing it's exactly the same as what Steiner calls Ahriman. It is a kind of a darker astral force. The same thing when you see, there was a whole trip about we're going to achieve the singularity, and Ray Kurzweil and all these incredible scientists. And they were like, we're going to do it and you're not going to stop us. But if you took a look at the look in their eyes, I mean, they just, it's like a Charlie Manson follower or something. There's a weird thing that they get possessed by. And I think that it's crucial for us to understand, that when you get on that level, there's a number of forces that are involved. Not that everybody who gets into a leadership position is a demon. I don't want to simplify things. I don't like comic book versions that I hear about these things. What I do see is that influence exists. And, it seems like this cloud taking over these people. Maybe they were black holes to begin with. It's possible. But in any case, whatever was there seems to be erased and replaced by this other thing. So particularly, and I've spent a lot of time listening to speeches like the Harari and people like that. I mean, Harari, I just think is a lunatic, so they've kind of gone over the cliff already. And they, we all know a good psychologist will tell you if somebody is psycho enough to go over the cliff, they'll take you with them. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We are here, X Series 149. I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com if you're new, especially, and sign up for our newsletter. It's a free newsletter. It keeps us in touch and make sure with all the important things that we have coming up for you that we're going to be, getting around any of the blocks, shall we say, on social media. We have incredible interviews coming up with Gigi Young, who's out there tonight. Can't wait. We just had a great interview series with Joseph Farrell. I have surprise interviews also coming up, unannounced stuff for May. And just wait, because those are going to be incredible. But we also have some fantastic X-Series shows coming up for you, including a whole theme around espionage. How are you going to like that? Olivia, we are going to take 2 more questions.
2 more questions.
You got it.
Okay. All right. So, transcend life. Are aliens complicit in keeping us in the dark, and why?
This is the interesting thing. Well, take it on the face of it. All right. And here's the face of it. There's been all this interaction with people. People have been abducted. In some cases, they remember, making hybrids and things like that. And David Jacobs' work is very compelling because he's been doing it for 4 decades. And we've had him on the show a couple of times. And let me tell you, the guy is incredibly honest and earnest in the work he's doing. So we've been dealing with that for a long time. So let's assume for a minute that the idea is these are beings that are coming in from another world, visiting here, doing all this stuff, etc. So they would have to also be complicit in the wall of secrecy, wall of silence. Then there's stories that at some point, we made treaties with these people, and part of the treaty was they could abduct people, but they would always have to let us know who the names of the people were. And then in exchange, we would get some technological advances from them. They wouldn't give us the best stuff. They would just give us stuff here and there. And then that at a certain point, whoever the aliens were broke that, and they just were abducting people left and right anyway. And that anything of the treaty nature that was established during the Eisenhower period is long gone. By the way, Stanton Friedman, who, was a very sober nuclear physicist who studied the UFO file very deeply. He's the one who found out that Lazar, for example, is lying about his college history. He said that these stories about Eisenhower meeting aliens and the way his schedule was rearranged and the personnel and people that he talked with who were at that Air Force base where it supposedly happened, that he felt it was legitimate. Now, that's pretty amazing coming from a guy like that. So there may be something to the whole treaty aspect, but Scott abrogated a long time ago, apparently. And then we went back into a shoot down mode against these things. Now, it does raise the question, using some of those stories as background, why those groups wouldn't interfere and let their presence be known by communicating directly with us and going around our governments. So I think it would be, for someone who was well versed in, shall we say, diplomacy, to figure out why they wouldn't do something like that. Possibly because they're under rules of their own not to do that. And, we get that whole kind of Star Trek thing about the non-interference. But I don't think that that's the answer. I think the answer is whatever it is that's going on there is, one, it doesn't conform to human norms. 2, it's whatever they're trying to do in secret. And so, yes, they're participants in the secrecy, whoever they are. And remember, it's interesting. I bring up Mac Tawney's, and I know Olivia likes this one too, but he said, look, my research, he was a very young researcher. He's a brilliant guy in England. He's 29, I think 30 years old when he died. And he said, my research has brought me to the point of thinking there's cryptoterrestrials. They exist side by side with us, and they're just a little more advanced technologically, but they've been able to elude us. And so he puts out this little thin book, Cryptoterrestrials, and dies mysteriously. Now, it's a sad death regardless if it was related to his work or not, but there is something compelling about that, shall we say. Just like there's something compelling to the episode that we did last week about the night side Atlantean technology. That technology, access to technology like that, exists in human hands. So, you know, there may be more than meets the eye on this. And then you have to consider some of the work about the older aerospace groups. And when we brought that up and talked about Delshow and things like that, it's very interesting that Trump is such a prominent name in those aerospace groups, and that it's, the whole Trump 45 thing exists in Delshow's art. I mean, the Delshow thing has been on the record for years. This stuff has been shown in museum for almost 80 years or something. So, there's no possibility of a hoax there. So what is that? There's some aerospace thing that goes back before even the period I was talking about with Project Blue Book tonight. It goes way back. Yes.
Last
Final question.
Okay. Well, let's circle back to RFK Jr. Ratboy Genius says RFK Jr. knows lots of things the general public doesn't know, but probably should. I think he's running as a service to share his knowledge. I doubt he thinks he will win. No,
he thinks he's going to win. I can tell you from my own contacts and things that Robert thinks he's going to win. And I do feel that there's a tremendous education. This guy can give one speech and he's a tremendous educator, which is good. It's a good thing to have that ability, because remember, most of the presidency is a bully pulpit. After all, as they used to call it, it's an educational tool to get people and drive them to, the right outcomes for the country. You need that gift. And that's something that he certainly has, I would say, dramatically. So I would disagree. I think that he thinks that he's going to win the primary and have a viable shot at the presidency.
I got to jump in. I mean, he is risking his life. I don't think he's going to do that just as a service to, wake up some people. I mean, he's playing for all the marbles, right? It's a high risk game.
There's no question. I think, we've had some good people come out and do things like what you're talking about. I think Ron Paul ran to educate people about the Fed.
For sure.
I think that at a certain point he knew that his chances were limited. But RFK, look, the Kennedys like to win. They do. And it's built in. If you read about Joe Kennedy and the things the obstacles he had to overcome, but he also had, almost like a complex. Like, I need to overcome this. I need to be the first Irish guy who's allowed into a Harvard club, And that chip on your shoulder thing can work for some people. And I think what he built in to the family was this idea of really achieving and not being second best. So, Bobby is in it to win it. He wants to win, and he can. It's possible. I think that on the independent side, that people who want to see the country move in a different direction need to get off of just being a one issue person and really say, who's the best person who can lead us out of this, whether I agree with them on everything or not. And we need to be led out of the nightmare of the Biden regime and, their CBDC that they want to bring in, their bank failures, their mayhem in the streets, their trans agenda, their wars, their phony nuclear emergency powers seizing, their phony cyber emergency, false flags. I mean, they're building up of the UFO threat. We need to be, we need someone honest at the top, and we need someone who's effective, who knows government and knows the history and knows about the UFO file, and we know that in both Trump and RFK Jr., the connections come directly. A lot of the research that we put out there shows that John F. Kennedy was killed over the UFO file. So, I think the compelling reasons are there. And I think, in the case of Trump, there's a reason why he's mentioning John. This is a battle behind the scenes about advanced technology. It can't be left out of the thinking equation in relationship to it. Yeah, what do you got?
Actually, I'm going to ask this question, make a comment. Adelac says, are there any next level positive agents out there working against these negatives, not talking about abstract? And the fact is, we all have to be those positive agents. The time for us to outsource all of that is over. This is all hands on deck.
I would agree with that. And it's funny because there's incredible ingenuity on the part of people to be able to do that. As soon as they have, an ideal and some momentum behind them, I think they can accomplish anything. So, I do. Do I think, that there are mystery schools that are helping to move the public forward? I do. But it seems like in every interaction, it takes people doing it on their own level. I think what happens is the people who become convinced, oh, we have to do things on our own level, can sometimes tune out about the top and be like, it doesn't matter who the president is. This time it does.
Yes.
That's the thing I've been trying to put across. It has to be made plain because you cannot go through this administration and then 4 more years of it, or whatever they install with it.
Yeah. I mean, what I was saying about Bobby risking his life, if we haven't woken up to the fact that all of our lives and our freedom is at stake here now, in this time, in 2023, not even waiting until 2024, we have to look to ourselves. This is, we have to ask those deep questions. What is the hill we're willing to die on? The time is now.
Oh, I would say it's true. 2024 has got to see a change in the leadership in the United States and the world. I mean, and we'll be lucky if we can just get through a year and a half of this. But I think it's a worthy goal, and we'll get there. We'll get there one way or another.
Yeah, actually, I'm going to quote Fuberbiter here that says, "We each of us must fear enslavement, not death." 100%. I agree with that.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm already too enslaved, and I am the frog in the pot and I know it, and I'm so uncomfortable with the knowledge and the feeling, that I'm already daily being exploited, squeezed, raped, and that, and it's enough already. And there isn't enough of a movement to kind of join. And I think that's the problem, is everybody's looking for leadership. How can I get involved? What actions do I take? Right? Not just individually, but collectively. We need some kind of a movement.
What kind of a peace do we seek? It's important. It's important. Not a Pax Americana, Kennedy said, forced on the world, because in the final analysis, we all breathe the same air. We all worship our children's future, and we're all mortal. Those are the words of John F. Kennedy. I hope I put across tonight just the level of heroism that I think John Kennedy displayed in his life and in the presidency, and that his leadership during the Cuban Missile Crisis saved the world. And we need kind of the the impression of that, the echo of that from that period to rise up in this time and bring us into that whole piece, because we sure have our share of problems in relation to this. And it's kind of fascinating because Kennedy also faced down tremendous opposition. He had the tremendous opposition in the world to the United States, and he had the tremendous opposition in his own deep state. So he faced off against it, and he triumphed by saving the world, but then he sacrificed himself ultimately through his death at the hands of our own intelligence agencies. So the question is, why? And I think we've put forward a good deal of that with the UFO file piece tonight, and it goes deep. It goes deep, as it were. Thank you, everyone, for being with us, and what a great crowd and great ideas room tonight. We will be back with you. There's Twining again. Let's not forget. We'll be back with you next week, and there may be some special reports between now and then. Like I said, fantastic shows coming up, and make sure you tuned in Friday nights, 8 p.m. Miss Olivia, your super chat.
Okay. Gillenjoy R, Don Newway, Brian Storm, Debbie McAdoo, Daniel Lazarus, Catherine Rorden, Young Crone, Sylvia Mandel, Gen X Nerd, Norman Smith, Occult Fan, Mark Lane, Fulcanelli, Echo Cat 23, Amarillo Gunrunners, Doreen Hewitt, Jay Parsons, Norman Smith, Jenny Runco, Erica Swenson Elliott, The Buddhas of Boston Sports, Catherine Farrell, Global Atlantis, Infinitum Neo, Antara, and Johnny Ricardo Bound. Thank you so much for your generous super chats.
Fantastic. Wow. We really appreciate your support, and it makes all the difference for everything we're doing here. And what I can say is we have some excellent, excellent shows coming up for you. And spending that time with everyone in the Ideas Room is a great pleasure when we do the live. And Miss Olivia, bravo.
Thank you. I just
Fantastic.
wanted to
Nicely
give
done.
everybody a shout out and just say, you're beautiful people. You have a wonderful sense of humor. You're smart. You're inquisitive. You're curious. You're passionate. You have integrity, and you deserve so much more from your government than what you're getting. And, you know,
really
my
true.
heart is
My
with you.
God.
with compassion and empathy. And, I just wanted to validate that your value, your worth, you deserve so much more. All of us do.
Oh, wow. Is that really true? Remember the Nikola Tesla King of Wands card in the CERN Tarot deck. We'll end the evening with that. And Peter Rabbit for tacos. Thank you, Peter. Martin Taylor. Part 2. Yes. Isn't that something? Dr. Farrell did a great job. Jason May, it was great to have Gigi out there tonight. We'll have her on soon. She's doing great work over there. Eurythmy is fun. Thank you. Coffee and snacks from Miss Olivia. There at sea. Blue. There's gonna be a lot coming up about Blue and how it is the reference name for the secret space program, and it runs deep. So we're going to do a series of shows coming up on that as well as the espionage. These things will make sense. And I'll tell you, Lloyd Berkner is going to show up over and over again, along with Antarctica. That was the weirdness in all this for me. But
Okay.
those of you who have been following will know.
While you read
yes.
things, I'm going to be right back and grab something.
Hand pink waving. Gil and Joy. Thank you very much. Fantastic. GJ says this, CERN Tarot. We did it. We did the 2 episodes on it, but Gigi, I think episode number 3 on that one. It's been long enough, and we know a lot more about their methods, shall we say. So great to have everyone here with us tonight. Fantastic crew. Anthony. That's a 4-leaf clover. Yes. Great show, Scott says. Thank you very much. Caritas Tarot. Time to focus. Oh, time for tacos. That's even better.
I went to grab my blue chicken, but it's not where I left it.
Blue chicken? Oh, yeah. I think I got rid of it.
Oh, no, you did not. It would have been a perfect ending.
I think it's been retired. Short Order Cook. Another fantastic show. Thanks, DJ, Olivia, and everyone. Fantastic. I know Kate's out there. It's great to see you. Salt of the Earth. Clear your mind and meditate. Well, I couldn't agree with that more. My goodness. Jason May, Kennedy, 2024. That really says a lot, doesn't it? We will see you all next week, and have a fantastic weekend, everyone. And remember, never let it be forgot. Once there was Camelot. We'll see y'all next week.
God bless everybody.
And you know, it says end broadcast, but
Never really ends.
it never really ends. Have a great night, everyone. Whew, what a show. My goodness. Unbelievable.